Excellent. So welcome to the Planning Commission meeting. The main item of the agenda today is to discuss the potential zoning associated with our housing element submittal. We're not planning to make a decision today on those. This will be an additional discussion. And that's the opening of the meeting. However, let's do our initial public comments first.
If correct. I think there should be a roll call, and then
Oh, yes, of course. Yep. Let's do roll call.
Announcement regarding remote participation.
Commissioner Krasinski,
Here.
Vice Chair Targ,
Present.
Commissioner Kopsil. Here. Chair Golden,
Here.
Commissioner Dixon. Here. Vice Chair Flynn. Here. Commissioner Breen. Here. Thank you.
And I am Renee Ortega, stepping in for Catherine Enberg. Just have a quick announcement. So I just want to make clear for the record, and it should be reflected in the minutes, that this joint Planning Commission and ASCC meeting is conducted pursuant to the California Government Code, Section 54953B. In that, Planning Commissioner Brothers is participating from 62 Colonial Drive, Rancho Mirage, California, 92270. Commissioner Brothers is participating by Zoom webinar. In accordance with the Brown Act, each teleconference location has been identified in the notice and agenda for this meeting. Also, I note for the record that we have a quorum of planning commissioners present in person. I would like to request that Commissioner Brothers respond to the following questions. One, can you hear me well?
Yes,
2, were you able to hear the proceedings on this end until now?
yes, I could hear Chairman John. I couldn't hear all of the other people, but
You can hear us now. Do you have a copy of the agenda for this meeting?
yes,
Have you posted the agenda at the location where you are?
yes,
Is your location reasonably accessible to the public such that any member of the public could participate in this teleconference from your location if he or she wished to do so?
yes,
Is there any member of the public there with you?
no,
Okay. I would now like to ask that any member of the commission speak up at this time if you have not been able to clearly hear Commissioner Brothers. Okay, hearing no comment, the record should reflect that all commissioners present have indicated that they were able to hear Commissioner Brothers clearly. I would now like to advise the commission that any votes taken during the teleconference portion of this meeting must be taken by roll call.
Okay, and what should we do regarding Carter? Since I believe he's remote, but we did not have any notification.
So he could participate as a member of the public.
He can participate as a member of the public.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, I think we're ready to get started. Do we have a staff presentation? Or are we going to go right to the ASCC presentation?
Do you want to do oral communication?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm off today. We have to do oral communications. This is for things that are not on the agenda. So if you're having anything to do with the housing element or the zoning, it's not your time. But if you've got anything else that you'd like to pass along to us, we would love to hear it. We probably cannot act on it or discuss it, but we would love to hear it. Is there anybody in that? I don't see anybody raising their hand in the schoolroom. Where are we on the public?
So I do see 2 hands. I have Carter and Rita.
Okay, let's go with Rita.
Go ahead,
Rita
Rita.
Gomez, please go.
Hi, thank you. And I did not hear the roll call being asked of the 2 different groups. But I just want to say how grateful I am for the ASCC meeting and for the last Planning Commission meeting and how clear they were, and how, the public really got to ask questions and be involved, which has brought you here today. So I want to thank you for your volunteering and for your commitment to our community. And really hope that tonight is a productive meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Carter.
Ed Carter.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm having a difficult time hearing everybody, John. And I was wondering if there's an opportunity to advance me to panelist. If not, I'll just be here as part of the public. I didn't get the notification in time to get the address, of my location. But to all of the answers that Linda answered affirmatively to, I do too, and there is no public here.
So Carter, I believe, I'm going to look to staff, but I'm pretty sure that's not possible. That you'll have to participate as a member of the public because we have to have that due notification in advance, not just at the time when you
That's
call
fine.
in. Okay. With that, we've got open communication over with. Let's move on to the main subject of this evening. Do we have a staff report?
Yeah, I have a presentation, and then after I'm finished, Rebecca Flynn, Vice Chair of ACC, will present the ACC's feedback.
Perfect.
And Adrian, did you have a meeting format you wanted to cover to address?
Yeah, I've got a
topics?
slide,
Okay,
so I'll bring
great.
that up. Thank
Thank
you. Right. Started. So first things first, meeting format. So starting with my staff presentation, then we'll move over to Rebecca's presentation on behalf of ASCC. Now, number 3, we're going to sort of segment a little bit due to existing conflict on behalf of one of our commissioners. So what we're proposing to do here is to have Planning Commission ASCC clarifying questions of staff. Only questions for multifamily standards and other parts of the draft code. So
Since Carter is not a panelist, do we have to do this? Or is there another?
It'd be me.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I
This
thought it
is
was-
Nicholas.
Got it. Thank
Sorry.
you. Sorry.
no problem. So that's what we're proposing to do. So again, questions for multifamily and other parts of the code. So just excluding mixed use.
So I do have a question on that I didn't think of to bring up earlier. Does that mean we're going to have to do a second round of public comments after 5?
So I would say maybe the best thing to do is probably move all the public comments to the end.
Okay.
So,
So we may have to split twice with the with
And
Nicholas.
alternately, I'd be happy to step out as is appropriate. And I'd also just like to clarify that I have an appearance of a conflict. I don't have an actual conflict. My firm represents one of the people who is looking to develop on Alpine Road. And from my perspective, I would like not to participate in that matter, even though it doesn't present a legal conflict.
So Nicholas, we could have you potentially step out twice then. That would be okay with you?
As is.
As is
appropriate.
needed. Okay. Because I'd like to I would like to keep the public comment to just one session.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So if you would like to break it out and hold public comment on multifamily or to that one property, I'd be happy to, and for the avoidance of mysteries, the Willows. So I'd be happy to step out during that time.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I'll look for your direction and the town attorney's direction as to when it's appropriate to do that.
We have to keep an eye on Nicholas.
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right. Okay.
All right, keep going. So I'm sorry I interrupted you. Let's keep
No,
going.
no, no, not at all. So kind of, you can kind of disregard because we've decided upon a new format. So that's fine. Okay, so our meeting purpose tonight is for Planning Commission and ASCC to come together jointly to discuss the ASCC's feedback and recommendations from their March 25th meeting. So the Planning Commission is then, we're hoping, going to advise staff and consultants on its recommended changes that are coming out of this discussion. And then staff will go ahead and start tracking those and preparing them for the next meeting. So for staff and consultants tonight, this is the whole team that's been working on this draft zoning code amendments. But in terms of who's with us tonight, myself, Renee Ortega, who's stepping in for Catherine, our town attorney. Christy Bascom, she works with Catherine and Renee. She's joining us remotely. And then Monica Sidlick, who's been with us for the past several meetings. She's here seated at the table. Roger Eastman, he couldn't make it this evening. He did join into our last meeting. And then we have David Bergman also from Lisa Wise Consulting. He's kind of new joining us this evening. He has extensive experience in housing elements and implementing zoning code amendments. So we thought, why not have him along to help us out as we work through some very technical discussions. Okay, quick background. Some of this is just, this is just a reminder to the commissioners up here. It's just for members of the public who maybe are just joining in. I see a lot more people in the schoolhouse than we usually see, which is great. So January 24th of this year, Town Council adopted our housing element. We submitted a few days later. We were deemed in substantial compliance. We were urged by HCD at that time to continue timely and effective implementation of all of our housing element programs. Fast forward to March 20th, the Planning Commission first met. They had a very full discussion. They gave a lot of feedback to staff and consultants, but ultimately determined they wanted further town input by an expanded public review process. So step one on that was Planning Commission said, we want ASCC to get together and review this draft as a group. And Planning Commission indicated that they were especially looking for technical guidance on some of the objective design standards contained in the draft. So here we are at step two. Planning Commission and ASCC are convening jointly this evening to go through all that feedback that's come in from ASCC. And then step three, Planning Commission is going to meet, we think, for one more meeting, and hopefully they'll have a recommendation to Town Council at that time. So March 25th, ASCC met. And they undertook a comprehensive review of the draft amendments. There was a lot of technical discussion, a lot of feedback to staff. How they went about compiling that feedback was they struck a subcommittee consisting of Chair War and Vice Chair Flynn, and then they put everything together. And that feedback is contained in the packet for this evening's meeting. It's attachment 2. All right, so in terms of the necessity of timely adoption of zoning code amendments. So again, this is a recap, but on February 5th, the town received a letter from HCD's Proactive Housing Accountability Chief, basically saying that we hadn't met our statutory deadline of zoning code amendments to rezone the sites on our arena. That was required by January 31st. Basically, if the sites are not rezoned, they're not considered available and able to be developed as per laid out in the housing element. So we responded, staff responded on March 4th saying, we're on it, we have a plan. It's beginning with the March 20th meeting. We're particularly constrained with a lot of openings for staff. We're doing our best and we're moving things forward. So we didn't get an immediate response from HCD. We felt optimistic and figured our good faith efforts are being recognized. And so we just trudge on with our process. On March 26th, the town received a letter from HCD stating it had decertified the town's housing element pending required rezones. So the idea here is once the town adopts our rezones, HCD will consider recertifying the housing element. Our understanding is they're not reopening the whole housing element again. They just want to make sure those rezones are complete. And ideally will be recertified in short order. So the issue now is we are no longer in substantial compliance with state housing element law. So we are once again vulnerable to builder's remedy. we've been here before as a town, so this isn't a new experience. Basically, it just means that the town cannot disapprove certain housing projects or condition their approval in a manner that renders the projects infeasible based on putting upon the applicant certain conditions. So where we're at right now is we have a running list of errata, so just editing errors, typos, things like that. What we're also adding to the list is recommended changes. So what we're hoping comes out of tonight is official recommendations from this group, directing staff on what they want to see. Then we're hoping to put together, again, a running list of all those changes. Given the short turnaround of when Planning Commission is next expected to meet on the 17th, we won't be able to create a new draft. We just don't have the time for it. So we're hoping that we'll compile all these changes, indicate what action staff is going to take to incorporate them and update that draft. And then once we get to council, we'll have a new draft for council, which has all the incorporated changes. So council can look at the original draft that PC started with, and then the new draft that has been informed by Planning Commission and ASCC's comments. All right, so next steps, again, Planning Commission would like to meet on April 17th to hopefully complete its review and make a recommendation to town council. Tentatively, we're hoping council will meet on May 8th for a first review. Because they're going to be adopting an ordinance, they need 2 readings on that, so they must necessarily meet 2 times. So tentatively, they would meet again on May 22nd, and hopefully by then we have things wrapped up. We can submit to HCD and move things forward. Yeah, for sure. Sorry about that. Sorry. Much better.
We have a quiet group out there. You can speak up if you, if you notice that. Okay.
Okay, so we're at the questions portion. But actually, let's hold on that. We're going to go over to Rebecca now. I think that's okay with
Perfect.
everybody. Rebecca, would you like me to run the presentation? Or do you want to share your screen? It's up to you, whatever you like.
Maybe I just say next slide.
Yes, of
You
course.
take it
Yeah,
down.
just
Okay,
one moment.
one
I'll pull it up.
You tell me who's speaking now. Is that Rebecca who's going to speak next?
Yes.
Thank you.
You can hear well, Linda? Yes.
I'm
perfect.
here.
Apparently you don't rate your own picture.
I can see it just fine.
Oh, okay, good.
Thank you. I can hear. I just can't place the name sometimes with the voices.
So this is Rebecca Flynn. I'm Vice Chair of the ASCC. Next slide, we're going to be talking about the ASCC's review of the proposed zoning amendments. And Adrian actually covered some of this in her introduction, so I won't repeat things that she said already. Our subcommittee was me and Carter, the chair of the ASCC. What we did was we synthesized and summarized the discussion from the ASCC's meeting, and the discussion, the starting point of the discussion was the zoning amendments that were provided to us. And what we did was create a list of the issues that we had found as a group and some of the solutions that we're suggesting. And these solutions are pretty much a sort of a starting point for further discussion. Nothing really is set in stone. And so a lot of the highlights, we created a document that's in your agenda, and this presentation is going to touch on sort of the highlights of that document. And I just wanted to note, have everyone be aware that we had very little time to work on this. I mean, we're talking about 2 or 3 days, a very compressed schedule. So again, it's going to require some more discussion among everyone here to kind of work out firm up details. And my final recommendations is that the ACC meet on Monday in our typical schedule to hash out some more of the details. And I think that will speed things up. Next slide. Oh, actually, is it easy to pop back real quick? So I just grabbed off the internet a few pictures of ideas of what other communities have done for multifamily housing, just so you have sort of some ideas of what other communities have done. So next slide. So what we found our first issue was really that a lot of what we view as the rural aspects of Portola Valley design guidance is missing from the objective standards in the zoning. And just a quick review, just pulling out really quick what's in our zoning. The purpose of the regulations is essentially to minimize disturbance of the natural terrain and preserve the inherent visual amenities of the town. It's also to provide grouping or clustering of residential structures where appropriate in order to preserve the natural amenities and open space qualities of Portola Valley. Next slide. And then within the proposed design guidelines is the intentions are written in there. And they state pretty much similar things, that suitable environment for gentle density on parcels of sizes adequate to accommodate multifamily dwellings of differing characteristics and broader ranges of affordability, incorporate fire resilient design, ensure privacy, preserve the visual amenities of existing open space to the maximum extent feasible, and then preclude unwarranted reductions in parcel sizes. So this all sounds great, that it's definitely matching with our design guidelines. Next slide. However, those particular things do not actually show up in the objective requirements. So a developer coming in wouldn't necessarily have to incorporate anything in there. So what we're really looking for is to have the building subservient to the landscape, to the natural terrain and topography, to preserve existing native plant patterns, to maximize our natural green space and minimize our built environment, to preserve the visual amenities of existing open space, and then all the portions of man-made elements, parking, paved areas, buildings, signs, lighting, et cetera, should be minimized and screened from off-site views and maintain privacy to surrounding properties to the extent possible. And then just in fitting with other homes within our Portola Valley, sort of the architectural elements derived more from a rural, agricultural, rustic, vernacular, historic roots. So as I go through the presentation and talk about the issues that we found within the zoning amendments, I'll discuss how we'll be able to potentially incorporate some of these requirements into the objective requirements. So next slide. So our second issue was really the lack of ASCC input into these developments. Not so much with respect to the zoning that we're talking about today, but just in the future. When applicants come to the town and submit a project, there's no real formal way to require the ASCC to be involved. Despite the fact that it is written there that all under 1812-050 required conditions, all permitted structures except single-family dwellings and structures accessory thereto shall be approved by the Architectural and Site Control Commission. And as Adrian mentioned already, what the public needs to understand is that we can require an ASCC review, but the ASCC cannot reject any project that a developer presents that meets the objective standards that are written into our code. So yes, we can talk about a project, but we can't say no if they've met those objective standards. So in order for us to have an impact, we have essentially two strategies. We create objective standards that produce the type of housing that we want and that can be built reasonably. Essentially creating standards that go from more simple developments to more complex. And we provide more flexibility, complexity, and incentives to developers to adhere to more of Portola Valley's design guidelines by going through the discretionary ASCC review, and preferably they do that early in the project before they've gone down the consultant lines with hundreds of thousands of surveys and whatnot. So we want to create design objective requirements that encourage applicants to come through the ASCC, so that we can have feedback. Next slide, please. So the third issue is that within the regulations, there are some that are missing And one of the most important one is the floor area ratio. So the amendments provide a coverage area ratio, and that represents the total square footage of the ground floor of a building. And what's there now is listed as a 35%, a 55%, or an 18%, depending on which zone we're talking about. The issue is if you don't specify a floor area ratio, the regulations do not place a limit on how big the units could be. So to give an extreme example, so that this is really clear, Glen Oaks has 4 developable acres out of their 17 acres. This is the property along Alpine Road where the horse stables is. That's owned by Stanford. A 35% coverage area ratio would be about 61,000 square feet. Again, this is just ground floor. If 3 stories are allowed, the property could then expand into what would be almost 175,000 square feet of housing, depending on the setback for the 3rd floor. For the 16 units in the housing element that are assigned to that site, you would end up having essentially 11,000 square foot homes. I don't think that's what we really want. So again, adding in a floor area ratio will be very important. Next slide, please. So the solution is to make sure we have a maximum floor area ratio that then takes account into the total floor area of the entire building. And then a potential additional requirement would be to simply specify the average unit size and the maximum individual unit size for the multifamily units. These are the kinds of details that need to be worked out among the committee, but the commissions. But if you said something was 1,200 square feet was the average size, then you could envision having a certain number of units, 500 square feet, and a certain number, 1,800 square feet, for example. Those are the kind of details that would need to be worked out. And then again, the other potential additional requirement would be to have applicants participate in an ASCC discretionary review that would allow them to have somewhat higher floor area ratio or larger unit size, for example, if that was combined with more public benefits. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm having to go through this really fast because I have a lot of slides and I don't want to take up too much time from the future discussion. So the 4th issue, for example, plate heights are not defined, and this can lead to more monolithic structures that might be overly extravagant or expensive, that wouldn't fit necessarily with the Portola Valley aesthetic and would not encourage affordable buildings. So a simple solution is you limit plate heights for any buildings that are more than 1 story, for example. Say it's 10 or 12 feet, which would lead to an 8 or 9 foot ceiling, which is pretty standard. And then again, and I'm going to come back to this many times, again, we could offer flexibility to developers and property owners by saying, okay, there's the potential for a higher plate height limit, if you go through the ASCC. Next slide, please. And so one of the big issues that everyone has is that the 42-foot maximum height that's been recommended for the MF23 multifamily zone is problematic. It has potential fire safety constraints. It may interfere with the preservation of open space, and it may cause issues with privacy for surrounding residential areas, depending on how far a building might be set back. So the solutions would be either to limit that 42-foot height to areas where it's not so visible, so against a hillside or a large tree backdrop, or to actually cut that down. So we've provided a suggestion of 38-foot for the multifamily 23 zone. And then the issue that I wanted to bring up in terms of potential fire safety is that I spoke with Kim Giuliacci, I think that's how you pronounce her last name, about the constraints for height with respect to ladder trucks. And what she explained to me was that even though Portola Valley does not actually own a ladder truck, in any type of fire incident, a call goes out to the nearest fire station in Redwood City or Menlo Park to support a fire. This happens as a standard process for Portola Valley. And they would bring their ladder truck if it was against a building that was very high. Now, ladder trucks are huge. They cannot make sharp turns. They need a large, wide road to navigate on. So for much of Portola Valley, they cannot access the buildings within Portola Valley deep within our hills. They are able, obviously, to be able to travel on Alpine Road or Portola Road and probably also Westridge, but maybe not, long driveways within Westridge. But certainly Alpine Road and Portola Road does not have an issue with, they would be able to handle a 42-foot height on those roads. However, if these zones that we're putting in place are become more generic so that they're not just applicable to the 2 properties on Alpine Road at the moment, then it's absolutely critical that any kind of development in an area that is not, that we need to put into there that developments must be approved by the Woodside Fire Protection District in the event that there's a street where a ladder truck could not access. And then I just wanted to note that density bonus rules and some of the new state housing regs for affordable housing, can result in higher buildings. So for the sake of Portola Valley, we really need to think about limiting the objective requirements for the baseline, so that in the event someone does come in and wants to put 100% affordable, the resulting building would not end up being excessively high. Next slide, please. So the 6th issue, which I think concerned quite a few people, was that there were no landscape or greenscape requirements in these objective requirements. What was in there is an impervious hardscape requirements, which we also have for regular residential, single-family residential. So it listed as, I have the numbers up there. I'm not sure if people are able to see my slide, but 35% and 65% for the 23 and 65% for the mixed use. So the simple solution for that is to add a landscape area ratio. So we proposed 35% for the 4, 25% for the 23, and 32% for the 6 for the mixed use. And also to consider reducing the impervious hardscape ratio. So the MF4 didn't change, but we're thinking that maybe we go from 65 to 45 and 65 to 50 for the other 2 districts, for the 2 zones. Next slide, please. And then privacy is also not included in the objective standards, even though it is within our zoning for R1 districts. So the idea of just simply adding the daylight plane regulation into these multifamily and mixed use districts would help alleviate some of the privacy concerns. And then again, I go back to the ASCC, potential ASCC involvement by simply saying that if you want a roof deck or decks above the 2nd floor would only be allowed with the ASCC approval. And that would be dependent on privacy issues. So again, I think there's a lot of space for, the group here to come up with incentives that encourage people to come through the ASCC. Next slide, please. And then the other concern we had with the proposed objective requirements is that they're very complex. They're designed for extremely large, multi-story buildings that one can envision seeing in Menlo Park or Redwood City along a public sidewalk. And there was no simple pathway provided for more modest 1-story or even small 2-story buildings. And this would be very discouraging for affordable housing projects. It presented some issues, I know, for the Ladera Church for what they'd like to do on their property. So our solution is that we do need to come up with some type of path for some objective requirements for someone for an owner who wants to just build simple single-story homes, maybe a cottage cluster or something like that on their property. So we need objective requirements for that. And then again, the issue of cost has come up. I know in some of the comments that I've read, or at least one of them, it's just, we do tend to put a lot of requirements in our zoning that actually are quite expensive. So we need to kind of keep that in mind as we create these requirements. And And I did want to really quickly bring up the Ladera Church situation. I did speak yesterday with a member of the Ladera Church Affordable Housing Task Force. And even though they would like to build as many, they are envisioning 3-bedroom, 2-bath family homes. But there's some negotiation going on between the task force and the actual members of the church who decide what they want to build. So it's not clear that they actually are willing to build an MF23 level of homes. So, the church may only want 6 as opposed to their being allowed to have 12 or even 14. So that needs to be considered as well. Next issue, number 9. So again, I've kind of mentioned this in other contexts, but the objective requirements tend to lack a little bit of flexibility. So, the architects and developers, it takes away their ability to be creative. So I'm not going to go through all these details of some of the things that we pulled out, but one of them that kind of struck us was the issue of requiring an 18-inch porch height in one requirement, and then in another requirement, requiring 15% of the units to be universal design with, direct entry into the unit. So it's a little tricky to be able to have those 2 requirements. So that's the sort of thing that we want to kind of get rid of overly complex specifications and perhaps just leave the universal design requirement. Next slide. And then the 10th issue we discussed was the off-street parking requirements are somewhat unrealistic. They are listed as for 0 to 1 bedroom, 1 parking space, 2+ bedrooms would be 2 parking spaces, and then guest would be 1 parking per 3 units. Given that most streets in Portola Valley really do not have street parking, nor do they have public transit. So, and you really have to think about the fact that if this is affordable housing, if a couple is occupying a 1-bedroom apartment, for sure, they're going to have 2 cars because they're both working. So the recommendation or the solution would be to increase that parking requirement because there will be no space around these sites for people to park, for excess parking to show up on the street. So that's something to think about. And I'm attended this morning's biking pedestrian traffic safety meeting, and they had just so that I could get their feedback on the zoning requirements specifically for parking and for bikes, the bike thing. And they had some very interesting things to say, and I just wanted to mention them briefly in this public meeting. They also had concerns about adequate guest parking for cars. With respect to the bike, there's a new bike park off-street bike parking requirement. They were concerns about whether this was for overnight versus short-term bike parking and the issues of security and maintenance. They had concerns about the e-bikes because e-bikes are becoming much more popular and whether or not it was okay, whether or not it would be acceptable for people to park them in their apartments because of the risk of fire. And then finally, they wanted to have their role clarified for evaluating driveway designs because they're supposed to be involved in that as well. So I don't remember at this point, having gone through so many of these different amendments, whether we're specifying that there's only allowed to be 1 driveway into these multifamily or not, but that is something that we need to think about as well. Next slide, please. So some of the zoning amendments were vague in certain areas. For example, there was no requirement for a percentage of affordable units for the multifamily 23 zone. The mixed use zone seemed to lack flexibility, specifying, the office dimensions that may or may not be critical. It was unclear whether or not certain of these, the 3-4 properties we're talking about would be allowed to engage in a lot split or not. And then it's unclear whether or not the multifamily zone could create a homeowners association or have condo conversions. So there's just some areas that, you know, we may or may not want to engage in, but they're not defined in this case. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick summary of some of the things I spoke about today, and I just highlighted in red what the changes were. This is the table that's in the zoning amendments, and you can see there's not a ton of changes really necessary to handle some of the biggest issues that we talked about. So just adding a floor area ratio, adding a landscape area ratio will go a long way to helping ensure that we do still have green space and that buildings are not overly large. This is just an idea thrown out there to encourage of, like, for example, 1 story, maybe we give 10% increase. I mean, again, this is sort of the sort of idea that we want to think about in terms of incentives to come before the ASCC. That was for MF4. And the next one, next slide, please, is the MF23. So similarly, the same thing, adding a floor area ratio, adding a landscape area ratio, and then playing around perhaps with the setbacks, so that they're based on height, so that as the buildings get bigger, the setbacks become bigger. And playing around with building separation, perhaps there's that too, could be played around with. And then again, we talked about lowering the maximum building height to 38. Next slide. And then for mixed use, same thing, adding a floor area ratio, adding a landscape area ratio, and then some ideas about building separation and side setbacks. Now, we didn't have discussions about the mixed use within our meeting. So, you know, we're just operating off of what was provided to us and then adding in this floor area ratio and landscape area ratio to it. So we just didn't have enough time to talk about mixed use. So, all right, next slide. And so then I know everybody can't read this, and I can't either, but from here. But the thing that is also sort of, I just, as I talked about all these potential ideas for change, some of them are really easy to accomplish, others are slightly more complex and will take more time. I also thought about the idea that a lot of people have asked about cottage housing. These are just clusters of small cottages, and it's an idea that would fit probably really well in with Portola Valley. And I pulled off the internet the municipal code for Langley, Washington, where they have a cottage housing, or a pocket neighborhood it's called. And just to pull off a few of the little ideas that are in here, they had it at 15 per acre. They required connection to a sewer system. They put a height limit, but they included a height for the ridge of a pitched roof. So you could have your plate heights, and then it would allow your roof to be above that. They specified exactly, you know, they said 50% the sizes of the average sizes of the units. They wanted small units to encourage affordable housing. So they have half the units have to be the bottom floor has to be no more than 650, and half have to be no more than 800. They specified the second story had to be smaller than the first story. And then interestingly enough, the concept of cottage housing is sort of a more communal type of living environment where they share a common open space. And they, in their situation, they required 400 square foot per unit and for this common open space. And they specified that a majority of the units had to actually face that open space. So these are just, you know, we don't really have to reinvent the wheel necessarily. We can take what other communities have done and just make some small modifications so that they fit to Portola Valley. So next slide. And then what's next? Again, my recommendation is that the ASCC meets this Monday to sort of hash out some more of these details for objective requirements so that we can provide it to, again, back to the Planning Commission in time for their meeting that Wednesday, just so that there's some more details of our thinking, because, you know, Carter and I met very briefly last week to put together, you know, his ideas and my ideas into the document, but we had no time to hash anything out or talk about things. And we had no time to come back to the ASCC to get their feedback. So I think it would be helpful to do that. So that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you. So next we will have questions from the commission members. of both staff and Rebecca, representing the ASCC. Just as a little, one of the things that may help you when you're thinking about things, when I get to the discussion section, I sort of have in my mind discussion around clarity on what is required, what's in scope and what's out of scope in terms of what we're trying to accomplish at the moment, which may mean some things that are great ideas are not in scope for what we have to do immediately. Also, I think we could do some work on establishing where is common agreement that everybody sort of says, yeah, that makes sense. Keep that in for the staff. Or maybe also, I think from a legal perspective, what we don't get a choice on. Because I think there's quite a few items that people would love to see changed, and the answer is going to be, sorry, not allowed by the state. And then finally, we'll come down to the plan to move forward. So Adrian had some of those up there, but I think us thinking about next steps and figuring out what do we do to drive this forward, and figuring out what can we do from a timeline perspective would be sort of the three areas that I want to make sure we cover in our discussion. So let's open it up to questions. And I guess we have to keep, now which section are we not talking about at the moment, Nicholas?
Pardon me, we are not speaking, we're not addressing right now on mixed use.
Not addressing mixed use. So on non-mixed use questions, who has questions? I'm looking over to the right because Ronnie, you happen to be right in my view. You want to go ahead?
Okay. I guess first, John, were you suggesting not to ask questions about kind of scope and what's allowed and?
You can ask questions on anything. I was merely saying those are the kind of things I would like to make sure we cover in discussion. And I was thinking maybe that might help drive some questions.
Okay.
But you can also have other stuff too.
I guess first, something that was in the agenda packet, which was related to a question I asked about in our last meeting, about the very high fire hazard severity zones and so there's a proposal to kind of change that text in the agenda packet. But it still says very high fire hazard severity zones in relation to defensible space. And I had noted that the Woodside Fire Protection District ordinance that's kind of being reviewed is going to apply throughout the whole town. So could we just remove the very high fire hazard severity zone part of that? And or do we need to have those in there at all? Because don't the Woodside Fire Protection District ordinances apply regardless?
Great, thanks for that question. I would first say when the code was first drafted, it was back in 2022. And at that time, it's sort of context informs why this got included in the draft. It was, fire safety standards was a big focus for the community at that time. And so there was a push to sort of carry through making certain connections to fire safety, even though you typically wouldn't see it in a zoning code like this. Our former director and former town attorney was in very close contact with the fire marshal at the time. And so I think that was a discussion between them. He's former fire marshal Don Bullard, that they were in discussions with. So that it's kind of reflective of a time. So to answer your question, I don't think it needs to be there. We could either modify it a bit further to make it even more generic, or we just strike it. I don't think it needs to be there. So if this group agrees with that, that's just what we do.
Okay. I guess following up, you just referenced Fire Marshal Don Bullard. The agenda packets referred to Fire Marshal Rob Linder. So he was the former fire chief. So is it supposed to be Chief Linder or is it supposed to be Marshal
I'm
Bullard?
sorry, that's just my mistake. Yeah, so it was with Don Bullard, who we're working
The marshal.
very closely with. However, when we got in touch to talk about the fact that Woodside Fire doesn't have ladder trucks. I spoke with Rob Lindner at the time. He was the one I spoke with.
Okay,
So that's why I mentioned him in the staff report as having informed that discussion.
I see, okay. So we're talking about having 3-story buildings now, and I imagine there's related requirements for fire safety in terms of egress and perhaps fire escapes and stuff like that. Is that something that should appear in the zoning code, and or is that already in our building codes, or do we need to think about that at all?
Right, so you got it. It's in our building code. So it would be beyond the scope of our zoning code amendments. The building codes address all egress requirements, and the most recent code was adopted by town council in October of 22. So that's in effect.
Okay.
But, sorry, but they would need to potentially be modified if we went 3 stories.
That's not my understanding. I asked our acting building
Okay, we
official.
don't have to discuss it. It was, if that was going to be true, I was going to have you note it
That-
as something we would pass along to the town council to deal with.
Right, and I asked him that directly. Do we need to make modifications to our code? And he said no.
Sorry.
Okay, so I guess coming now to the ASCC's proposal and recommendations. So there's the section on defining the rural character in the objections, in the objective requirements section, which when I read through that, those, at least what was specified there currently did not seem very objective to me. It seemed subjective. So I guess maybe without getting too much into the discussion right now, would staff agree with that, and or do you think there's small changes that could be made to those to make them objective, or is it a large undertaking?
So I agree with it, how you've characterized that. I think, rural character is kind of an abstract idea. But it is what makes the town special. And so I understand ASCC's concern with trying to capture that. So I think it's actually this group's challenge tonight to figure out if we can quantify it and make it somehow objective.
Okay. Regarding the ASCC's, one of their proposed solutions to create early design review opportunities for projects with the ASCC, and possibly including a SB 330 meeting limit waiver. So I guess in general, is something like that legal for us to pursue here? And if so, how far could we go in restricting the objective standards? Like, for example, constraining it down to only allowing single story in the objective standards and requiring design review for multiple story. Sorry, I'm going to kind of proceed to a multi-part question. So if we do go in this direction, could we keep it very simple, and perhaps instead of elaborating on all the possible exceptions, like let's say increased plate height or something like that, could we just have something very generic, like a statement, applicants can request exceptions to the objective standards with a discretionary review process, and leave it at that? And or does that concept already exist, and do we need to state something like that?
Yeah, so let me see if I can get at your question. So I think first of all, it's important to understand, and I think that's one of the issues you raised, the chair, is what this group is trying to accomplish through these amendments. And what I understand is to, one, implement what was committed to in the housing element, which was to rezone these sites and adopt certain standards. Now those standards, that process is to provide a ministerial path for approval of housing development projects, right? Separate and apart from that, there may be a discretionary review process either that exists in your code already, or that could be something that is, considered at a later date. But right now, really the effort is to implement the housing element And part of that is to go and, one, rezone these sites, and two, adopt standards that relate to those sites. Identifying separate processes within those sort of then gets beyond what is intended to be accomplished in implementing the housing element.
So are you more or less saying that we are not able to say something in here along the lines of these are the objective requirements, but if you want an exception, then you can follow an alternative discretionary review process?
You know, part of it is understanding what that process will be, right? So, and there may be those processes that exist in your code already when it's not a ministerial type project. And so it's hard to sort of then create, you know, processes within certain sections of the zoning code where there may already be other processes in place. So that, you know, there needs to be sort of a wholesale look at that to understand, you know, before you start putting processes in place that kind of conflict with the other parts of the code.
Okay. As far as trying to limit the square footage of buildings in some way, is somehow reintroducing the AMFA limits feasible? And I would imagine that some of these lots already have established AMFA.
Maybe I'll start and then Monica, if you want to jump in. We're a little hesitant, staff and consultants, just when we're thinking this through, a little hesitant to apply AMFA because we're worried about reducing site capacity. We don't want to do anything that limits the development potential that we've indicated in the housing element. So if we start introducing too many controls, might we start to reduce the ability for a developer to develop the units as we expect? So what we're thinking is if this is a recommendation that this body would like to put forward, some of these things we may need to test out and literally just sketch out, take a look at our sites, and just like put it through just sort of a high level feasibility analysis. So that might come up several times this evening. If it's something you want us to explore, we'll have to do a little bit of work prior to the April 17th meeting. So in this case, we're thinking so that if we're doing AMFA, we would need to do some site testing. Go ahead.
Right, so we understand that the AMFA is and the reduction of FAR that leads to is a very valued part of how built form is regulated in Portola Valley. And it's true that the draft standards that we developed, the residential built form is really regulated by density. And we did not introduce a maximum floor area, which would then be reduced by the AMFA. And that's for the reason that Adrian described. That said, as Commissioner Flynn has pointed out, there are other ways to, well, we understand there's a concern about oversized structures, about large units. And we heard a lot of suggestions for how we could start to rein that in. We could regulate that further. So as we entertain changes to the standards, we would want to do what we did previously, which is, okay, here are the standards we're going to test out. Let's test them on the site. Let's see how much building do we get? How bulky is it? How do we require all of the standards? Like, what do we do? What does that amount to? So if we're thinking about, okay, there's density, there's setbacks, there's height, potential floor area. If we're layering all these on top of one another, well, we don't want it to be too complicated, right? And we want to make sure we meet the site, we can allow the density. So we might think about, as Commissioner Flynn mentioned, or suggested, maybe an average unit size, or maybe a minimum or a maximum units, and establish a range. So that might be one way of ensuring that these standards don't lead to outsized units. and respect while still relying on the setbacks that we developed to respect the neighboring properties and the open space. So that is our recommendation. Instead of using the AMFA to limit floor area. We'd prefer not to do that. It introduces a constraint into the potential for residential development. And that's not something we want to do for these zones that are, that the housing element is relying on.
Okay. So I guess trying to understand issues related to subdivisions and condos and HOA, if I just use Glen Oaks as an example, let's say that that property is developed with 16 units. Would it be possible that those units could be individually sold as, I don't know if condo is the right term, with the HOA? And or would it be possible to then have that parcel subdivided into 16 lots that each had one unit somehow?
So definitely the condo arrangement, HOA, that's permitted by state law. So just because it's not explicitly stated in the zoning code doesn't mean it doesn't apply. So certain, and we expect that. So for example, if a mixed use lot gets built out, the acreage is minimum 1 acre. Well, then how does that work? If we're going to have multiple units, it'd be a condo type arrangement with an HOA. So we fully expect that. Historically, the town is single family, so we don't actually discuss condominiums in our code as far as I could find. I did a search. So if that's something we get into down the road, we want to just clarify it. That would be a good recommendation for a broader comprehensive code update. We could update our subdivision chapter and add in some discussion around that. But for now, I want to be really clear that HOAs and a condo arrangement would be permitted. It's definitely a viable method to have a small housing development. In terms of further subdivision, Glen Oaks could further subdivide, but they have the dwelling units per acre minimum and maximum. So you couldn't subdivide very small, or else you couldn't support units. You couldn't support 2 to 4 units per acre. Also, we have the lot width minimum of 120 feet, I think it is. So that would have to be supported too in a subdivision.
Sorry, let's see. Okay, so for the affiliated housing sites, it says depending on the density, the design standards that the affiliated housing sites will either follow the looking at the wrong side. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. Yeah, in 1829-060 C, for the affiliated housing sites, for their development standards, basically, depending on the density, it either follows the RMF4 or the RMF23. And I guess my question is, how is the density for affiliated housing sites determined? Given that they're probably being built on a small portion of a larger property.
Monica, I might call on you if you're able to answer that one.
Yeah, so let me think about this. We have in mind, we looked at the unit capacity on the Sequoias and the Christchurch. Let's see, so I think it might be better if we review, so I know that the development of the happened a year or more ago, and we worked with the town attorney at the time, and we thought about what was most likely and most desired on the sites that would be developed with AH. I think it would be better if we gave that some thought and remembered exactly how these standards under 1829-060 fell into place.
Were these,
Start that time.
were these new or were these just moved from the other location?
This specific one that I'm asking about is referring to the RMF4 and RMF23, which are new. So at least that part of it must be new, right?
Well, the housing element specifies how many, I don't,
Well, they're definitely new standards for affiliated housing. We haven't had this before, so we're trying to codify the program and layout standards.
Mr. Chairman, I actually brought up a lot of questions about these affiliated housing sections at our last meeting, and I don't know if staff's had time to go back, but the drafting of it was so general that I thought it was problematic. So I think the suggestion to go back and look at it more in detail is a good idea. I found it just so open-ended that you get away with just about anything in it. So I'm not sure where Ronnie's going with this question, but I offered that because you weren't there.
Thank you. So I'm guessing we don't have an answer to
Yeah,
that
if
question.
we could circle back on that.
Yeah, we
one.
may have to come back
That
to
would-
circle. Sure.
Thank
Okay.
you.
I could yield for now, or are we also supposed to ask questions to the ASCC now?
Absolutely.
Okay, maybe.
We can
so-
come back. There's a lot to cover here. So if you
Yeah.
want to, I'll circle back around. If
How about
that's
that?
okay.
That's fine.
Okay. Let's see, anybody next? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, why not, Linda? She's got her hand up. Linda, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't sure if you can see me or not.
Well, Nicholas looked out for you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. I don't intend to ask a lot of detailed what if questions at this point. I feel that's probably beyond the scope of what would be useful at this point in the process. But I am concerned about a couple of things that I'd say are more at a policy level. For example, if you allow more parking and more vehicles, when and where do you foresee that we would deal with the traffic consequences and the evacuation impacts of that? Is that something you would just let go and we do it in the zoning code, and then each particular project would have to deal with it in a CEQA document? So we'd be segmenting all of these. And I guess I asked that question in particular focus on the sites that we are currently considering making these zoning changes for. And I guess the second part of my question is, I think this task can be massive if we try to make these changes for other sites rather than just those sites that we have on our plate. So I guess I'd like you to answer both aspects of that question in terms of a more generic answer.
Is that a question for staff or legal?
That's really a question for, I think, the ASCC in their proposal. I mean, they're proposing that we need to add more parking spaces
Ah,
in the objective standards. Sorry, good.
I think it's just a question of reality. I mean, if you have 23 units on a property and no available street parking, you've got to have an expectation that the parking will be placed on that property. By limiting the amount of parking available, it's, you know, it's not going to solve the issue of excess cars. For evacuation and traffic, we didn't really consider that because it's, I don't know how much it falls under our purview. My understanding is the EPC, the Emergency, I don't know what the P stands for, Commission, Preparedness Commission is going to be presenting something tomorrow about traffic that may or may not take into account the potential extra cars on the street, but certainly that is something that should be considered. And then traffic, it seems that that should go back to the staff, the issue of traffic.
I guess, Rebecca, to me, it's an example of the kind of question, and it also came up in your discussion of the fire safety and the large engines. To what extent are you guys on the ASCC just focusing on the sites that are going to be, that we know of, quote unquote, along Alpine and along Portola, or contrast to that, sites that might later appear somewhere else in one of the windy streets, for example? That's the point I'm trying to get at here. Maybe I used a bad example with traffic, but what was your thinking on that aspect of it?
I would say our thinking was to consider the actual lots that have been put in the housing element, that these new zoning codes are written for. And one of the issues we did have is that they're written somewhat generically with the anticipation that possibly the same multifamily code would be applied into other sites yet unidentified. The reality is in Portola Valley, there'd be very few sites that would be able to accommodate an MF 23. They would all be on major thoroughfares. They would not be up in the hills. So that one is less of an issue. Obviously the MF4 and the upcoming opt-in would be more widespread throughout the town. But again, my understanding, and this hasn't been defined yet for opt-in because that won't be considered until next year, but we're able to restrict that to sites where access is good and there aren't tight cul-de-sacs and small roads. So to a certain extent.
So I guess my question is, do we need to specify that in the language of these codes that we're writing now? That's not in the language that we're writing now. Don't you think, do you think we need to specify that?
That the code is just, that this particular multifamily development is only specific for this site. That's what you're asking.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Or the sites under consideration.
Adrian, do you have or law? I don't know.
I'll probably ask Town Attorney Ortega on that question, but before you jump in, we did definitely go back and forth on this in our last ASCC meeting. I am inclined to make the standards a bit more generic so that they could apply to subsequent sites. However, realistically, we're probably not going to be looking at rezoning sites, you know, wholesale until our next housing element cycle. We're going to have to go through it again. And at that time, there's no way we're not going to require zoning code amendments anyways. So maybe it's not such a bad thing to have these standards written mostly geared towards our sites, you know, realistically. But I'm not sure if we can state that in a code, like a generic municipal code that's supposed to apply townwide. Are we able to say multifamily applies to this property, multifamily 2 to 4 this property, multifamily 20 to 23 this property?
Generic in a town where every property is utterly different. So you just, I don't know what the answer is, but that's the reality of what we've got going here. Some houses, some properties are in ravines, some properties are on top. You know, it doesn't relate to, it's going to be tough.
Was there
Yeah.
any other thought from legal on that?
No, that's essentially what I was going to say. I mean, part of what you have under consideration is these specific areas that you're rezoning and the development standards that are being adopted for these areas. And again, I think in the future, if there are other areas that would be designated as part of a rezoning within the town, and there were changes to the general plan, then at that time, again, you would consider potential zoning code amendments, considering those properties that are also going to be rezoned.
It does seem to me that, and I'm not saying this as a lawyer, but if there's a presumption that we're operating under here, without necessarily saying it as a prescription, but if there's a presumption, maybe it's worth laying out that presumption, because I think it may make it a little easier. I guess along the same lines, again, I guess this is for Rebecca. In a number of instances, and I could pull up my notes, but you know them as well or better than I do. You talked about allowing different bonuses under certain circumstances, but you didn't get specific as to when you would make those determinations. So, I mean, I know how that works in a city lot or, in downtown San Francisco, but is that something you would intend to do in the next week or two at the ASCC? How would you put that incentive system together?
Yeah, we'll figure it out for sure on Monday. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
I think that today, maybe as a group, we can kind of maybe come up with more generic language that would allow sort of more flexibility potentially. If an applicant comes through the ASCC, I mean, we are talking about essentially 6 lots, right? Or even, is it even less than that? But they're all residents of Portola Valley. They've all talked to the planning department. They all have ideas of what they'd like to do with their properties. So it seems like we should increase the dialogue with those property owners to try to figure out what would make the most sense and what we could bake into incentives versus standards. But yeah, there's no way, given the tight time frame and the reality that we have got to get these zoning amendments passed as soon as possible to avoid, potential for
Right.
builder's remedy, that's a priority. So we cannot get bogged down too much into details,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Well, I was teasing, of course. I know that it's a massive project, but I think the use of incentives is important, because as Dana points out, everything is so different where we live. It's not like down in the flatlands where I grew up in Palo Alto, where you just roll out the trees and roll in the houses. So I think the use of incentives is good, but I don't know how you craft it. And I guess that's where I was trying to go with that. Is it all just in the discretion of the ASCC, which is fine with me. You guys are amazing, but I guess how do you craft it? How would you go there?
I think if we were to meet Monday, we could come up with some ideas in a limited scope, and then we could go back to the town and town consultant who have experience coming up with incentives for certain things, whether it's height or setback or bulk or whatever. They might have more ideas to kind of put a grip on it. Given the limited time, we probably would only want to consider a few of them and somehow write the language in a way that, if an applicant wanted something more, then they could come through the ACC. But we would still, as the ACC, be required to come up with, it would have to be baked into the code about how we would be making decisions.
Exactly.
So.
Well, I like that approach, and I think that's a really good answer. My final question, and it may border on a comment, but at our last planning commission meeting, we talked about, I think I brought up the subdivision code, which requires that anybody building a subdivision has to set aside land for parks and recreation for the subdivision. I can give you the quotes, the section numbers if you need them. And if the developer doesn't do that, has to pay into an impact fund. In the work that you guys showed us today with your different, land use and parking uses and so on and so forth, you didn't put anything in about land use that would be what I would call parks or recreation as part of a development. You do have some open or landscape areas. Is that something you just didn't consider? Or is it something you considered and rejected?
Yeah, we did not get to that. Yeah, it was only based on evaluating what the zoning amendments were there and whatever was there. We didn't consider wholesale changing the subdivision code.
You didn't consider what's missing from the zoning code amendment. I wasn't referring to changing the subdivision code. I was referring to including a similar provision in our zoning, in our mixed, not the mixed use, the multifamily section.
No, we didn't. I mean, we considered each of those properties as their own development. And what we wanted to ensure was within that property, there was adequate green space. It wasn't necessarily going to become common park green space. It would be for that property. And I think we have to think in terms of, we're trying to build affordable housing. And if we continue to put more costs onto these potential 5 applicants to then invest in a fund or create a public park, we're never going to have any affordable housing in this town. And we're not going to have any building whatsoever, whether it's affordable or not, to meet our RENA code. So I would discourage adding another cost onto these particular lots. I don't know if the rest of the ACC has comments about that.
Can I just
Bill,
jump in?
aren't we taking
Sorry.
land that's already in the parks and turning it into housing to begin with?
Yeah, I just had one comment. I wanted to go back to one of the things that was discussed, and that was sort of the incentive process. I think what should be kept in mind is that if this group were to go down that road, I think you'd want to make sure that those were objective, that they are not constraints on development. And just keep those 2 things in mind. Can't be a sort of any subjective sort of discretionary review as part of that process, considering what is the hope to accomplish here.
That's all I
And there
have,
was-
Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to call a 5-minute bio break. So if we meet back here at around 8:35, that would be good. Going to need another set of questions. If I could have everyone's attention, please. Perfect. Let's see. So who do we have next?
I've got questions.
You've got questions. Go for it, Nicholas. And remember, you can't have questions about MU, right?
Oh, that's the least of the.
Through the chair, we could briefly touch on Ronnie's question about affiliated housing. Is that okay to do?
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. If you got a better answer, yeah.
I have questions later.
We have an answer instead of none at all, so we'll try that. Go ahead.
If I may, yeah. Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. It had been a while since we thought about this section. So the site inventory identifies a certain number of units on these 2 AH sites. And they're more than the base zone would support. Both of those sites are zone RE. So it was really as simple as we need a zone that will sort of describe and support and shape the kind of density that the housing element anticipates on those 2 AH sites. And we had just developed an RMF4 zone. We had a new zone on hand that supported that kind of development. So we inserted a provision that should those sites be built out at the density for the number of units that the housing element anticipates, just use those numbers. It's as simple as that.
Which ones? Because that section, I mean, it says if the density is up to 6 dwelling units per acre, it would be the RMF4 development standards. But if it's greater than 6, it would be the RMF23 development
Right.
standards.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a big jump, right? So both of the sites that are identified here would be less than 6 units an acre.
It would be less.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Nicholas, I think you're up.
Sure. First, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the ASCC. We kind of pitched you a live one, and you batted it back admirably. And there's a lot of work, in particular by the chair and by the vice chair over a very short period of time. And I'm sure that we all appreciate the work that you've done, and couldn't be happier for your expertise and once again showing the value of the ASCC and your review. So suffice it to say thank you. I want to start just very quickly with Fire Marshal Kim's comments about the truck ladders. So it sounds like the Woodside Fire Protective District doesn't have a ladder that can reach beyond 30 some odd feet, 20 some odd, 30, pardon me, 26 feet. So beyond that, we'll call up our friends over in Menlo Park and Redwood City and hope that they don't have a fire going on that's taking up their ladder. Is that my understanding of what do we know how many ladders they've got? Do we know if that would delay the amount of time it would take to get a ladder to town? All right, that's helpful. Thank you.
You could restate what they were.
So my
Thank you.
understanding of what you've just said is that there are two municipalities with which we have a relationship, including Redwood City and Menlo Park. And the city of Menlo Park has two ladder trucks. One is located in East Palo Alto. The other one is located and that Redwood City similarly has some number, but we don't know. Is in Redwood City proper? Got it. But it would cause a delay in responding as compared to having one within the district. And
May I just add, my understanding is the mutual aid agreement extends for the entire county. It happens that the closest ladder trucks are in Redwood City and Menlo Park, and I guess East Palo Alto after that. But there, as I say, agreement is with all San Mateo County fire stations, fire districts.
do we know what the additional time in response would be?
No, not at this point. I don't have that information.
Okay.
That's a net. Yeah.
I'm gonna leave that alone. Always important to have nets on hand, but thank you. There was a response to the fire marshal saying, we got it. And was there a response yet back from the fire marshal?
So I need to follow up on that. The email was directed to Town Manager Sharif Etnan.
That makes
and
sense.
He's away this week and I need to figure out if they're in a conversation right now or not. It's on my list to follow up. I do want Fire Marshal to have a chance if she would like to review and provide any comments prior to the next Planning Commission meeting or maybe prior to Town Council. It was not our intention as staff to exclude her. You know, we had engaged with former fire marshal to quite an extent
Extensively.
Totally. It was extensive but that was back in 2022. We have a new fire marshal. She wants to familiarize herself with the process. So it makes sense that she would want to be engaged, on her own behalf. So that is on my list to check in with her, to figure out where that conversation left off and make sure she's not left out of the process.
So if I'm out of order, but I recognize I'm out of order, to the chair, if it's appropriate to have the fire marshal to extend the invitation, if you could make that request to staff, that would be at least my request.
I would officially make that request.
Thank you, Chair.
That we are out of order because that's really discussion items, Okay, but
I know, I told you I was out of
Okay.
order. But
more questions.
I do have more questions. In reviewing the dozen or so recommendations of the ASCC subcommittee, I think that the most substantial 3 items maybe are the FAR recommendation, the objective standards recommendation, and maybe 4th is the height limitation low plate, and potentially also the landscape area as well. Would you agree with that?
What exactly did you mean by objective standard?
So,
Which,
so there was a identification that there were within the intention section, there were a number of items that weren't included. And I believe the suggestion was.
the rural aspects.
Yeah.
That's sort of design
And,
guidelines, yeah.
Do I understand that did I get it? Are those the primary items that you have?
I think we need to add the simple buildings up to, sort of the pathway for a simple building in the objective standards as well.
So it's a question to the acting town attorney, whose credentials are strikingly similar to my own. I couldn't help but notice. So it's very nice to see a fellow Eagle at the table. There are a lot of recommendations, some of which are pretty ambitious to get from here to there over the next 2 weeks or a week and a half, 2 weeks. Are there limitations that we would have if we were to identify, for example, in a resolution, the need to or the value of establishing a discretionary pathway through the ASCC, for example? Previously, staff, Adrian, this is for you. Staff identified that they were going to be working through the guidelines and translating the guidelines into objective standards. I recognize that we have 1 staff right now, so that's probably not what she's doing at the moment. But it's something that can and should be done in my mind. And I don't know whether we can do that after we submit our zoning code, or whether that would be a retrenchment such that we would find ourselves at odds with HCD.
So and again, just so to sort of maybe put it a different way, what is trying to be accomplished here in this process is to come up with objective standards as required by the housing element, as has been committed to. Certainly, there could be a retrenchment if there was some subsequent effort to sort of undermine those objective standards that had been let's say, adopted. But there could be in the future, a separate process for some type of discretionary review. And again, that wouldn't undermine this process, that this process would exist, and then there would be a separate process for discretionary review.
I understand what you're saying. So let me repeat it if I can. So there are two things here. One is that if we want to have objective standards, now is the time for us to establish those objective standards.
Yes.
And if we want to create some optionality that would establish greater flexibility, but with potential additional process, that would be acceptable, provided there wasn't my words, retrenchment of the building envelope or the opportunity to develop.
Correct.
So if we want to create our objective standards, staff would need to, or we would need to get to work on that kind of now.
Yes, I believe that that is what's in the documents that are under review now.
We have as you may be familiar or not, we have a design guidelines guidance document, which is really interesting and pretty extensive. And I think one could have an interesting conversation about the objective nature of them. So if we wanted to fold those in, we would expressly reference the design guidelines by name and incorporate them by reference into our zoning code. And we would probably do the same thing with our lighting code. And those are the two codes that I can think of offhand, but we would include those by way of reference and make the assumption that they are objective.
I think there would need to be a review to determine whether or not there are objective.
If we weren't to do what I said, and again, let me put this in the form of a question. Is it right that if we weren't to do what I said by including them by way of reference, then they would be outside of the objective standards and they wouldn't be applicable?
Say that again.
We have design
I
guidelines,
understand.
which are just that. And presently, I don't believe that they are, and our representatives from the ASCC, there we go, can speak to this. They aren't expressly referenced in the code. So if we wanted them to appertain to the code going forward, we would need to incorporate them now by way of reference rather than going through an additional process of translating them into different standards. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the what you're talking about is maybe a process, not necessarily whether those guidelines themselves, number one, are objective, and number two, whether or not they're consistent with what has been articulated in the housing element, correct? So putting those two issues aside and not whether there could be some process for having a document that is then just referenced in the code. Yes, there are other jurisdictions that have done it that way where there are objective standards and it is a document, which is then incorporated by reference into your zoning code.
So
But
to follow up, would that be comparable? We reference our fire code. We reference our building code. Could we reference our design standards code?
so, yes, again, not without looking at the merits of what is in those specific documents. That is certainly one way some jurisdictions have adopted objective standards. So, but the work itself would be sort of the same. It's going through that document to make sure that they are consistent with what is the objective here, which is to implement the housing element. And number two, that they are indeed objective.
Yeah, to be sure. I don't want to flush our design guidelines. And I don't think that that's been the intent of anybody going forward. As through this discussion, and again, acting planning director.
I'm not acting. I'm just here.
Oh, she didn't get any
We're
more money.
Thrilled that you're here.
You get more
I-
money if you're acting.
I'm still a senior planner. I'm just
Thank you.
running the show.
But I'm right that we don't have, that there was an effort that was discussed. And I don't know, I don't think that that's,
I'm not familiar with specific direction on that because I know the design guidelines, they're guidelines, they're not codified. And of course, they're primarily geared towards single family housing, right? Because that's what we have in this town. No, but I don't recall that discussion, Nicholas. Was that on the 20th?
no, we discussed it sort of back in, as we were going through the,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Okay. So you're right that no specific effort.
it's okay. It's one of these things where been a lot of changes.
Okay.
That may be one of them. I think that's all that I've got. Thank you.
Nicholas, I quickly wanted to comment on our language, on ASCC's language, and especially the landscape part, that most of the sites that we're dealing with right now are in the scenic corridor, and we approach those differently. So I think in terms of doing objective standards, we're trying to apply what we feel about the scenic corridor almost everywhere. Okay.
Dan, I think you're up.
Okay, great. I have a few questions. This first one's very basic, but I don't have a clear answer in my mind, so I will ask it. Oh, we've promised to the state that we would build a certain number of units on different sites, and let me just make up a hypothetical 110. But we have not promised what size those units are, right? So as we go through this, it seems like we have some tough sites, right? Oh, we got a scenic corridor, 75 feet, creek setback here, side setback, put the height on there. Pretty soon, it could be pretty small building envelope, right? If it ended up, I don't know what the legal limit is for a unit, 200 square feet, that wouldn't be good, right? Like we could get 10 units, but they're little tiny ones. What guidance do we have or to decide if, and I think Monica referred to taking the numbers we had and then working out a plan. How do we know if we've made units that are suitable in size? What's the guidelines or limits?
Well, yeah, we don't stipulate a commitment to a certain unit size. It's units. That's what HCD is looking for. We have committed to pursuing different opportunities for a variety of housing types and sizes, and that's to increase housing diversity, and that's for fair housing law. So I think it is good strategy to create a code that allows for a variety of unit sizes. So when, Commissioner Flynn was suggesting we could have a range in unit types so that we don't end up with really large, mega homes, because that's really not what we're after. We're trying to increase the diversity of our residents who have different housing needs than just large single family homes. So I think that's a good goal.
And I was just going to add that on the other end, there are, at least in the building code, as I understand, some limits in terms of how small they can be.
All right, I was trying to get above that absolute minimum building code violation number, but yeah. And Monica, I think I understood that we could either go with this coverage area, like in the draft from March 20th, which is quite generous, but then overlay on top of it, tell the builder, oh, you can only build 4 that are 1,000 square feet and 6 that are 1,500 or something. And then that would constrain how much of that big area they used. Or we could do the floor area ratio where it adds all the floor areas, and then it's up to the builder's discretion how they divvy up the units. Am I right about those two options? That a planning commission has those two options?
Yes, yes. We could introduce a maximum unit size or an average unit size or a
Mm.
range of unit sizes. That's true.
Mhm.
There could also be a floor area. There could be a floor area, like a floor area in terms of square feet.
Mhm.
There could be a floor area ratio. We currently, so Adrian a moment ago mentioned testing out the sites, which
Mhm,
is what
mhm.
we did initially. And so we used the standards that we proposed. And we looked at the setbacks, we looked at the
Mhm.
height, the upper story stepbacks, and accounted for the sort of on-site open space requirements, everything that went into it, and parking, of course, and then, and access, and developed building forms that would, we sort of looked at how much building would you need to support this density, the maximum density? And is this reasonable? Does it translate to a total floor area that is a range of 0 to 3 bedroom units? Is it the right amount of space of building?
Mm.
So that's part of the testing that it went into. And we would want to do the same should we decide to introduce other standards to limit building bulk.
Mhm. I see, but you're getting at the question I'm asking. When you get to the end of that exercise and you go, oh, look what we ended up with. What's a good answer to you and what's a bad answer? I kind of heard from that answer, you were looking for, oh, well, there's a 3-bedroom that looks pretty good. Oh, there's a 1-bedroom that looks pretty good. Is that what you're looking for? Just something that seems good to you and your colleagues to make a 1-bedroom, a 3-bedroom?
Yeah, well, we're really just looking at boxes, like in
Mm.
terms of like, how does it look? That the modeling doesn't really reflect that. But we're making sure that we can support the densities that are in the site inventory in the housing element. That's the goal. And that amount of building would support the unit size, the unit types that are identified in the housing element as well. Here, I'll turn the mic over to.
Yeah, I just to suggest the approach of maximum and minimum unit sizes is a strategy that accomplishes a couple of goals for you.
Mhm.
It guards against this concern of buildings being, units being.
Yeah.
Right, units being too much. And it also provides for a diversity of in the housing stock, which helps to meet your housing mobility. FAR is another approach you could use. But the FAR is an area that can be shifted around,
Mhm,
stacked,
mhm.
moved around in different ways across the site. So an effective strategy we've seen in other communities that are concerned about this question and are trying to incentivize the diversity of unit types are maximum and minimum unit sizes.
Okay, I really like that. Yep, okay, thank you. Oh, you know what, I'm concerned about this. I think we're under pressure to make objective standards, and Adrian, you used the word rural. Can we make that more objective? And like, well, that sounds hard. How are we gonna know if we made them objective enough? You know, when things are numbers, like 20 feet from the side yard, I get that, that seems simple, but all these other ones, how are we gonna know? Are we just gonna have to do the best we can and then you give it to HCD and they come back and go, ooh, this word's kind of fuzzy. Ooh, we don't know what you mean by this. Or do professionals have a good sense of like what's gonna pass muster?
Well, I mean, there is a definition which I can read,
Oh.
but maybe the professionals can give some more sort of practical
Thank you. Yes, I guess I would say we rely on that definition, which is in the statute. I'd like to think that after 4 years of doing this, SB 330 was passed by the governor 4 years ago. We have a good sense of what is objective. Sometimes it's a bit of a, let's sharpen that language a bit. That's true.
Okay, but you do you have, or what's your level of confidence that if you read, let's say we make a pass and you edit it a little bit and we submit it, do you have a pretty good sense of what HCD is going to accept, or it feels like a crapshoot to you too? Like, oh no, we'll send it over, see what they come back with. I'm very sensitive to getting into a infinite loop, right?
So just to be clear, the government code has a definition of what an objective standard is. And it requires that there is no personal judgment being used as part of the approval process, and that everything is verifiable by reference to an external or uniform benchmark.
It's pretty quantitative.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
And that benchmark needs to be knowable to the applicant as well and the general public. So it needs to be disclosed. So the government code, it's not, nobody would like to tell you that HCD is a hard animal to figure out more than me. But this one is pretty cut and dry. The government code says what's an objective standard and what isn't.
Okay. It pretty much has to be numeric then, right? Or
Well, it could be something like a material could be specified.
yeah,
That's,
okay.
Council, is it correct that a determination of a nuisance by a fire marshal would be considered to be ministerial, or would that be considered to be an objective standard? Looking at the totality of circumstances and applying her her professional.
Since by a fire marshal,
Mhm,
is that,
mhm.
no, that would not be.
So that
objective.
wouldn't be ministerial, that wouldn't be objective, that
No.
would be a subjective standard?
But I'm not sure how that sort of fits within.
When one is looking at an objective standard, one thinks of things like things that are ministerial. And what I'm pushing back on is the idea that it has to be that it can't be fully descriptive, but it doesn't need to be numerical, quantitative, or an exemplar like wood. But it can include a broader range of descriptors that would allow one to know it when one was presented with the issue.
Well, maybe two things, right? One is an objective standard, right? And the other one is sort of the ministerial process.
Right? Which
Right.
is also
So-
an objective determination.
Yes,
Yes.
in a sense that if you've met the objective standards, then you really need to do no more.
Correct. So that's the analogy that I'm making. So, I mean, I think that it's not right to say that an objective standard needs to be a quantitative.
Well, he gave examples of a material that
but-
was also.
Or a specific material. It could be of a like or kind that can be inferred, but it's doesn't.
Okay.
It's.
I'm set on it. Can we go on?
Sure.
If you could
It's your
just-
question.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe we could just read the statute. I can, that would help.
Go for it.
Yeah, I
So-
think
That'll be
so.
quick, and then we'll
It's a-
close that.
It's a design standard that involves no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and is uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official before submittal of an application. So, and when there's any sort of doubt, it's usually against the public agency that has adopted that standard. In other words, in favor of the developer interpretation, if there is some
Okay,
wiggle room there.
all right. No, thank you, you all. And my last question's for Rebecca. Thank you for your presentation. what's your confidence level that one more meeting of ASCC, you can get this to a tidy level with the objective standards that it could be, near a form that we could make into a resolution at our next planning commission meeting?
Well, I was just playing around with it right now as we were talking and trying to create, looking at the non-objective standards of the rural concepts, in our design guidelines. And I think there's a bunch of things that we could create that are objective, whether it's quantity of screening, the square footage of screening from the street, the average unit size, and the minimum and maximum size. Those are definitely numbers right there.
Good.
The setbacks create a certain level of privacy. The privacy plane at the setback, that's a simple number. So that would handle sort of privacy. The building heights, that's, we could specify 2 stories, for example, I believe, as the objective standard for this, and not allow 3 stories. And then that goes into the incentives. The landscape area ratio we talked about, that thus requires a certain amount of green space on the property. That's, that's a ratio, that's a number that would enable it to be more rural, because we'd be requiring that. We haven't really talked about it a bit, but the idea that within the design scandals is that the town doesn't want us moving a lot of dirt. So I don't know if that plays into it somehow. We have that for sure with single family homes. You then have to get major permission if you want to move a bunch of dirt. So I don't know how that applies for these flat lots that we're talking about. And the concept of basements and stuff, but it's less an issue for these flat lots. But again, if these zoning gets expanded to other lots than the 5 or 6 we're talking about, then limiting dirt movement becomes important, because if you're building on a hill, that's a number. So that would be possible, though it's not relevant for these particular lots we're looking at. So those standards we could definitely come up with pretty easily, I think, because it's, we've already talked about most of them. Some of the other ones that are a little more tricky, materials, that's a lot of that is already in the submitted standard, what in the zoning amendment. So we could certainly match that. Natural materials required, fire resistant materials required. Those are all specific things. Yeah. So certainly a lot of those could be done, pretty simply, because I think it's already
And that'll be
done.
enough, though. What I'm trying to avoid, or at least understand, is it many meetings before it gets to a state that the planning commission could review it and then make
I
a
would say
recommendation or
no.
not?
I would say we would limit.
We've got a lot to understand where we're headed on Monday night.
Right, but I think if we limited it to a certain number of these objectives that we would definitely want to be forced into these zones into these objective standards, I think it's possible for us to come up with that list that takes our rural aspects, our rural design guidelines, and translates them to at least a bare minimum of requirements could be done.
And my last question is, at the March 20th meeting, when we reviewed the design standards, one thing I found very interesting and actually attractive is that it tried to regulate in what seemed to me a quantitative way that somebody'd know where they were, that something had to look good. It kind of prevented what I call Soviet block, a cement with the simplest windows you could do. That wasn't going to be allowed. It was going to be, if you have a 30-foot wall, you got to have an indentation. If you have this, you got to have another indentation. You can't have just flat plain windows. They got to have like some trim. They got to have some depth. I'm like, wow, I hadn't thought what makes things look better rather than a cement block. are you guys gonna try, oh, because now if it has to be objective, I don't think you can say needs to look good by Ann's standards. Will you also include some of those things that were in the old one? This is hard.
So speaking for myself, I don't think our concern was so much with all those details for the more complex projects. I think they serve their purpose. I think our concern was more that knowing that some of these projects, like Ladera, for example, want a much simpler project, that those guidelines were just overly complex for what they want, which they're looking at essentially probably single-story modular, possibly a few second-story modular. But this was way over the top for them. So I think we would have to include all that for the more complex projects, essentially. So we wouldn't want to get away with, get
But-
rid of that concept of more variation on the front.
Can I just ask the harsh question? You would allow 6 cement blocks if they're
Mm-mm.
small and little?
No, I don't think so, right.
So you are gonna put, you need then some more rules.
Right, yes, within the, that's sort of the concept of what can be done for these simple projects, what would be the definition of acceptable appearance, exterior appearance for them.
Right, if I may. You know, Lisa Weiss is an expert in this area and is quoting the legislation requires jurisdictions to approve projects by right without discretionary design review process, says planning consultant Lisa Weiss. So yes, we anticipate increased design for objective standards and form-based code, which is essentially what we're talking about and which the Weiss organization is apparently expert in, at least in the high demand areas and jurisdictions with the resources. So this is what we're talking about isn't a remarkable or new kind of development, but it is a newish, more or less increasingly off the shelf kind of approach. We did exactly this approach, different organization doing this for the city of Richmond. And other people, part of Oakland is the same way. So, you know, I think.
I'm just trying to check the scope of what ASCC is gonna try to get done on Monday and see if we can help corral it in, or, so you are gonna come up with, on the small projects, then also overlay or get help to overlay. It's gotta look good.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the sort of thing we may have to go back to the Lisa Weiss consultants for what's off the shelf, essentially, for how to define a small single-story building, for example, what would be easy and not expensive and would fit with a modular home. I mean, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, that would be my question for Monica. I mean, do you have already those sorts of standards for single story or double story that's simpler?
You're asking if we have ever developed a set of standards that can be used for simple, really modular manufactured homes. Well, we do, you know, we do zoning code updates, comprehensive code updates, all kinds of code updates. So we do develop standards for homes in manufactured home parks and manufactured homes, modular homes. We do develop standards, and those are often different from single-family homes that aren't modular. So, all right, this gets a little bit complicated. There are mobile homes that are legally defined as such, and they tend to have standards. There are also sort of prefab homes. In a lot of cases, we will write codes such that those are. I mean, you don't disallow them, but they should comply with the standards of any other single-family home because they're considered to be that. You can also develop. We have written standards for. Okay, let's say you have a shipping container and you want to modify it so that it can become a dwelling unit. yes, separate design standards for that would be different from that of a regular single family home with a foundation. So yes, yes.
Let me also sort of amplify and simplify this. Your housing element calls for the creation of a permitting process for modular and manufactured homes. So some manufactured homes are covered under federal statutes, actually. And there's HUD requirements for the production of and standards for trailers. But for modular and manufactured homes, you could have a separate pathway. And it would meet one of your commitments in your housing element. It would allow you not to condition or dilute your approach in this multifamily zone with a concern about the deployment of manufactured and modular product. So hearing the point, I'm trying to resolve the points of friction. It sounds like the point of friction is you would like to reserve the option for an applicant to have a pathway for modular and manufactured homes. That pathway could live elsewhere in the zoning, separate from the multifamily. Because you could have standards, separate standards for manufactured and modular. Hearing this as the point of friction, I would recommend that approach rather than encumbering the multifamily standards with this carve out.
So looking at that particular program, the language is, we're talking about incentives here, which is interesting. The language is program 4-3, ensure the permitting process for modular and manufactured homes is clear and does not include any disincentives to using these building methods. So if using that building method is disincentivized because it doesn't comply with the window standards or any of the other standards, then that would be counter to the direction in your housing element. And for that reason, you may want to think about that.
I mean, I think that's way interesting for the ASCC to think about. Do you really want small houses? Are you imagining them getting built kind of custom? Or you really are thinking of manufactured houses? And then this pathway of the manufactured seems way better and could save time when we're under the gun for the next 2 weeks or 4 weeks.
And
Did you have
also,
additional questions? Sorry.
I'm done now.
and it also allows you to report progress on a program in your housing element.
John, could I ask
Yeah.
one more question
Sure.
related to it?
I'm
Could,
getting to you guys, by the way.
yeah, sorry. So could we segment the standards based on affordability? Like, for example, we have a set of objective standards that apply to all projects, but we specify that if a development is, say, 100% affordable, then there's an alternative set of objective standards that apply.
So, I mean, for that, you really would have, if somebody were doing a 100% affordable project, you'd have state density bonus law and you'd have all sorts of other, you could ascend, even if you created incentives or if you created different standards, let's say somebody were doing 100% affordable, potentially they could say, well, we're just not going to comply with any of these, right? So
I guess, in other words, as we go through and define all these objective standards, if an applicant has 100% affordable project, none of those standards apply anyways. That's what you're saying?
I mean, they can make the case that none of these standards should apply. There's under state density bonus law. So again, they'd have to go through that process, identify the specific standards that they would want to seek waivers for and make the justification for those waivers.
And maybe, what if we wanted a different level, like 50% affordable, then some other set of objective standards apply?
Again, I mean, you're talking about the interplay between somebody who's looking at state density bonus law and what they can do with that, right? And can I just do what I want to do with state density bonus law? Or do I go and, look and try to meet these standards here?
Sorry, you're referencing the density bonus law, but does that apply to the design standards like the window trim and the porches and all of those
Yeah, I
objectives?
believe any standards you can request a waiver.
Okay,
Hmm.
and that applies at what affordability level?
So, there's a whole table
Yeah.
that for which, depending on what affordability you give and not only the affordability, but also the percent of the number of units that are going to be affordable, you can request different incentives and concessions. And in that sense, there's up to 4 that you can request, depending on how deep you go on the level of affordability and the amount of units that are affordable. Separate and apart from that, so that's incentives and concessions. There's sort of a waiver that's very broad that gives someone and make the case that with the incentives and concessions that are granted, if the project cannot be built as designed, they can request a waiver of development standards. And that would be essentially, unlimited number of requests of certain waivers.
Just to put a finer point on it, you'd be hard pressed to beat density bonus law. You know what I mean? As offering the best incentives to a developer. Like waivers and concessions, and as long as you come at different affordability levels. So our challenge as a town would be, is there some other alternative structure that would be more compelling than density bonus law, which is pretty permissive if you meet the affordability requirements?
I guess presumably we're going through the trouble of defining these objective codes for developments that don't meet those affordability requirements.
That's correct. There is some showings. that need to be made. That's correct.
It's establishing a floor. You'll be able to, if you have a certain level of affordability, it's a depth of affordability, you can request some number of either waivers on the design standards or on the setback or helping requirements.
Okay,
So, but it does establish the standard, and the only way you do it is to demonstrate that it's reasonably necessary.
Yes, I mean, you have to make the case for it. Usually involves some level of economic, feasibility that needs to be demonstrated or shown that if you had to comply with this standard, it would make it economically infeasible for you to develop it.
okay.
There's-
I guess my original question wasn't about the density bonus, but are we able to define objective standards A that apply at a given range of affordability level and objective standards B that apply at a different affordability level in terms of percentage of development that's
You'd also
affordable?
have to make sure to take into account, and again, I'm assuming that if there'd be greater flexibility and you'd be able to do more with some level of affordability, is sort of what you're getting at, right? Because the opposite, I think, you'd sort of begin to get into fair housing issues.
So yes, it would be more of this.
Yes. I'm not sure in terms of whether or not you can do that legally. I mean, potentially there might be some issue we need to look at. But I think also trying to develop those standards and how they would apply and then administering it. I mean, suddenly you're getting into potentially some subjective criteria. I mean, I guess if there were percentages, but it can get very complicated, right?
Excuse me, but why would
Ma-
we want to do that, Ronnie?
Like, for example, if we want to have simpler standards to enable modular
So,
homes.
so
or-
that's discussion. I'm gonna say, let's move on that one.
May,
Oh,
may I add?
you may add.
Thank you. I'd like to point out so these concessions that we're talking about, these waivers, they're about project feasibility that's we found to impact, and they apply project wide. So it's not like they apply just to the affordable. It's, you take it all together. And I'd like to point out one standard in the draft that we're reviewing. It's affordable unit design. Affordable units and market rate units in the same group of buildings constructed under the same approval shall be constructed with the same exterior materials and details so that the affordable units are not distinguishable from market rate units. We have, when you have a mixed project, I wouldn't, let's not delete that one.
You run into fair housing to create circumstances where they're visually.
Yeah, just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting differentiating that one.
Okay, now I need to give our ASCC folks a chance to ask questions. So, questions of anybody? Staff? Legal? Consultants? Go for it.
Okay, I will not ask a lot. I know we're trying to move this along. So I had a question, as we were talking about some of these more objective standards, i.e. like earth movement and how that's a concern of the ASCC. And is it possible to, I guess, define something like an earth movement limit, kind of like we have now for the existing zoning districts, that would then trigger ASCC review for a project and maybe have that similarly with height or something else? I mean, I'm curious of the legal implications of that, because it feels like there's a desire kind of by everyone up here that the ASCC does have some sort of review of these projects, but that seems to be at tension with the reality that that they don't have to go through kind of discretionary review process. So I'm just wondering, as we're contemplating things that might get added into the objective standards, or what we could take from the design guidelines to put in, how we could kind of utilize those standards in conjunction with an ASCC review process being introduced.
So I would just say that if it was objective, then triggering sort of ASCC review might just be, are you meeting the standard? Yes or no, right? Because assuming it's objective. Secondly, you would potentially, as part of this process, there's a separate sort of permit streamlining act where there's a 5-meeting rule. So you're kind of then eating up one meeting as part of that process, right? And these meetings include, potentially even appeals in terms of the 5-meeting limit rule.
Okay. And I have a question just about, it sounds like a lot of the zoning criteria in terms of the coverage percentages, that those got a lot of feasibility study. And I was curious if the objective design standards kind of went through the same feasibility analysis, and if they haven't, if they could, just thinking in terms of, when I was reviewing the zoning amendments, just kind of going through and saying, okay, what can I do with these that is objectionable to the community? And what can I use these standards to create something that is something that everybody would like, that would be very appealing? Or are they limiting in a way that doesn't allow that? And I guess I'm curious about like the feasibility analyses that have already happened. And if I know there's not a lot of time, but is there some amount of that could happen with these, just to kind of further test them? Because I think you guys can chime in. I don't think it's our desire to take all the objective standards out. And I think, as Rebecca was saying, there are aspects of it that are great and that will be really helpful with larger developments.
Maybe I can start and jump in. There was definitely a ton of iteration in the process, and just like Monica, myself, and our former director, Laura Russell, former town attorney, Cara Silver, back and forth and thinking through this, and would we want that? And would this appeal to the town? And would this fit in? So it was, because you mentioned feasibility analysis. It's not really, you can't do the same sort of feasibility analysis that you can do with site planning. That's a lot easier when you're actually just plotting things out on a site and using measurements and setbacks and bulk. And so you can't actually do the same type of feasibility analysis in the true sense. It was more just a prolonged exercise of trying to make the right decisions and think through what our decision makers would like to see. Definitely true. We were thinking through, okay, we're suddenly going to see a lot larger building type, a lot denser than this community has ever seen, and this is very scary. What can we do to have as much control as possible, right? And to stipulate this is what it's got to look like. And so we really tried hard to go through that exercise, but you know, it was just 4 of us. And that's why we're here, certainly, to get this feedback and to have the tough conversations about the what ifs. But it's really, really hard. Like, this is a really difficult exercise. So I feel for you all sitting up here trying to make these hard decisions.
We feel for you too.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, well, that's so much better. Was there another response coming?
Yeah, if you wanted to add on to like how we thought through the standards, why we put together this package of standards.
Or could I just add another question? With kind of the testing of these, are there architects involved in this? People who would be taking these standards and applying them? Curious if they're part of that testing, seeing if they can break, how they can kind of make or break with it.
Yeah. We can provide resumes of the team members involved. I don't, I have a master's in architecture.
Well, no,
I
that's
don't,
a,
and that's
that's a
not,
good,
yeah,
I think that is important though. Just I'm not saying that without being an architect, you weren't qualified to look at them, but I just think that if someone's doing this as their job every single day, they're looking at them a little bit differently. But I think that is an important qualification to know.
we work with a lot of communities developing these and
Yeah.
design review committees and planning commissioners, most of whom have some sort of have some experience and knowledgeable input. And we need to know about best practices and how those vary among regions. And just having worked on zoning codes and developed regulations for built form and design, we just pick from the best of our experiences and try as best we can to take a lesson from what we see in each individual community.
Mhm.
We did some design standards for Los Altos.
We've prepared objective design standards for communities across California, some very comparable to Portillo Valley and some different. But yeah, this is something we consider the simplicity to the end user as much as possible. The flip side of it is the trade-off with the simplicity to the end user is obtaining the outcomes that communities with very demanding requirements will meet. It's a balancing act. There's some communities we can go to and our objective design standards can be really simple. It can be an envelope. Here are your setbacks, height, bulk, site coverage.
Mhm.
Our expectation is that that would not be sufficient in this community. So it's always a trade-off.
Yeah. That's a good question.
Rebecca?
I wanted to answer Anne's last question in terms of the simple building concept. I think as
the ACC could commit to at least brainstorming in the session to how we might envision some objective standards for simpler buildings. I think we could commit to that. And if we felt it was in the end of that brainstorming an impossible task, then we would, say, okay, we're not able to do this and hand it back to hand back our preferred requirements to the planning department to come up with something. So I think we could commit to that, at least to brainstorm and see if we can come up with something. I guess my question is for the town attorney and for Adrian. For the objective standards, I'm not really sure the best term, but sort of the base level that we can establish would be based on what? So if we were to say, can we say we want our objective standards, you're allowed to have only single story buildings? If we could fit that many into that zone, can we say you're only allowed to have single story buildings? Is that allowed, or is that putting a restriction on?
I would say whatever it is that you committed to in your housing element in terms of what can be developed in these zones would sort of dictate that.
Okay. So if we could somehow find a way of putting those 23 units in that 1 acre, then we could say, okay, 1 acre, this is the unit size max, and this is you're limited to 1 acre. We could say that, not that I'm recommending it, but.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to take other things into account, including potentially sort of unit size, range of unit sizes, and that may impact whether or not those could be, in a single story structure.
Okay.
So,
Sorry, can I just ask to understand that? Are you saying, you referenced what we committed to in our housing element, are you saying whether we committed to single story or multi-story in our housing element, or just the feasibility of the number of units?
feasibility of those units.
And how is that determined whether it's feasible or not?
Well, I think that's why you have folks like sitting at that table trying to figure this out.
So this is the balance.
I guess I meant from HCD standpoint.
Right. So this is what we're going to come to. So this community is now in an unusual circumstance, which you're going to need to do your rezoning and then submit the rezoning back to the state. The state is going to evaluate it against the commitments that you've made already on the sites, the site capacity in the housing element, so that you can retain the RENA capacity at all income levels throughout the entire planning cycle. So they can evaluate it in that respect. Is the capacity, the realistic capacity, preserved? There's another piece of it that they're going to look at too, which is, did we create constraints? Did we add new constraints? And if the answer to it is yes, and God, I wish they were demanding objective criteria. The objective criteria they demand from us, they don't hold themselves to. It's going to be a subjective evaluation by HCD as to whether or not you've added impediments, right? But that's the jeopardy that it gets to be, that the standards face when they come back for review in the rezone. Have you created new impediments towards housing production? And it will be up to the reviewer to decide. There's no objective description in the government code as to what constitutes a constraint.
I can also tell you from experience with working with another community, when the argument was, we can provide all this parking and these units at 24 units an acre in 2 stories, HCD took issue with it. It's not going to fit. You're not going to fit it.
Wait, they don't think
This is
that
a different-
24 units at 2 stories can fit on an acre?
No, well, yeah, it was 25 units an acre, and it was, the city was insistent that, yes, we can fit that in 2 stories with this parking, the parking you want. but it-
That gets to my earlier question, though. What unit size do they judge it against? If you made them very tiny, that would fit for sure.
Yes, and you run into fair housing problems.
So how do we know when we've squished these sites too much and we don't hit our HCD numbers? I'm very unclear how you all are going to evaluate it or how HCD, because as Rebecca says, like, oh, well, if we just said 1 story, 75-foot setback, 25, 50, 50, the community be happy and think, yeah, that won't be objectionable. But the units wouldn't be there.
And they'll know.
Yeah, so here's
They're-
here's the problem. Not only will they know, but also I can tell you they're very familiar with the reviewer. Now I'm talking out of school, but.
Right, but it's the
You're
truth.
also talking
you
away
say-
from the microphone.
How do we know? And the answer is, having worked on 17 housing elements in this cycle, 40 going back to the 5th cycle, interfacing with HCD's review of objective design standards in communities in both Northern and Southern California. And I wish I could give you certainty. The name of the game in this, as this community is aware, when we are sending something for review by HCD, certainty is not something any of us get. We'll work with you to provide you our best advice. And so to that question about, hey, if we can do a massing diagram and submit that massing diagram that shows everything at, 1 story, enough units, size, variety, sufficient, maybe they would take it, maybe they wouldn't. But that was what was required in the example that Monica was describing. It was a whole separate contract where we ended up doing essentially hypothetical site plans and massing diagrams with the developments.
So let's go, Rebecca, 4 questions.
You had quickly just mentioned fair housing as an issue. So what were the aspects of fair housing that they would have problems with?
So one of the loosest piece of the housing element analysis is the affirmatively furthering fair housing, because it's not defined anywhere in the government code specifically what's required. And one of the main elements of the 6th cycle was to require housing mobility. Think of housing mobility like social mobility. And so the agency is looking for communities to produce a variety of housing types that allow for identified special needs populations to be able to move into high resource communities. So they would question, for example, could a low income large family, because that would be the large family as an identified class, could a large family move, right? If we just made 200 square foot micro units, they would say that you're running into a housing mobility problem. You're foreclosing the opportunity for social mobility in your community by the housing type that you produce.
So is a 3-bedroom adequate?
Yeah, but it would be a mix. What they would look for
Right,
would be
yeah.
a mix. And I wish I could tell you what the formula was, but it's going to vary.
Okay. And then can an impediment to housing development be just the costs of construction?
Well, if you burden it with, I'll give you a good example of this, which is something that happens with inclusionary housing, right? So we're writing inclusionary codes all across the state right now. And HCD requires, if you have an inclusionary requirement above 15%, that they review, they require an economic analysis and that they review the economic analysis. Because one of the things that communities tried, this was real common in Marin County, was once inclusionary was allowed after something called the Palmer fix for rentals, they said, oh yeah, you love the idea of inclusionary housing. We put 20% requirement on things. And then they would say, oh, you like 20%? We're gonna put 25%. And the point is it became a de facto housing moratorium because you burdened it with additional costs. So that's a precedent where they're looking out for that.
Okay. Thank you. My last question is related to the mixed use, so maybe I hold off on that one until we finish this.
Okay. Dana,
Questions.
you have no questions?
Work it out Monday night. I'm also, and so part of this, part is only available for 3 hours. So that would be 10 o'clock for him. So hopefully we'll get to public comment by then.
Okay, well, I have questions.
Okay, I
So
know you do.
we'll have to do those.
But just keep in mind that he's got a 10 o'clock.
First question. So there were several comments that came in from the public about items that they thought were in the housing element that then when they saw these draft zoning requirements thought had been kind of thrown out and lost. Is there any truth in that? So there's two questions. One, is there kind of some truth in that? And secondly, if there are specific items that were part of the housing element that related to things like, would pick the Tyson property, creek setbacks, that we put in our housing element, do they have to be in this new zoning code?
Well, certainly the new zoning code can't contradict what the housing element says. The housing element, in the hierarchy of what documents we're deferring to, it comes first before the zoning code. So what we're trying to do is carry through any commitments we've made in the housing element and flesh it out in the zoning code. So we're not discussing, so I can just make statements about mixed use right now. Okay.
Well,
Let me just abstractly say something. So in the code, we did allow for certain general development standards for a given zone and say that we are committing to these standards. We're going to add to them via the development of objective design standards in a subsequent zoning code amendment. But here are the main standards that we've laid out. And we got to those standards through conversations with landowners and neighbors, some of them very extensive, drawn out discussions that went back and forth for a long time. And so we could only do so much with the housing. The housing element is not the zoning code.
right.
So we did lay out some certain, so you mentioned creek setback. We mentioned a creek setback, for example. We mentioned front yard setbacks that we want to commit to. And so I don't have any.
So that's good. So what you're confirming for me is things that we're objectively put into our submittal are things that have to be reflected in our zoning code that we put in. And if there's any mistakes in the draft code, it's something we want people to let us know, and we'll fix it because the housing element takes precedent.
Yes. And I am quite confident that what we have in the housing element is reflective of the
Okay.
negotiations and conversations we had. So if the public comment is the housing element's wrong, that's a different discussion.
Right. Okay. Have we done a comparison? And my apologies if I missed this, but one of the discussions we had when we were going over the housing element was how did the new zoning codes compare to the surrounding properties? With the idea being that if it was similar to the surrounding properties, that was a good thing that would make people more comfortable. Did we ever do that comparison?
It certainly went into those negotiations with landowners and adjacent neighbors. And we tried to control for that with, I want to say generous, but like reasonable setbacks that allow for privacy and setback of uses. I mean, you can't, if you have a single family, large estate right next to a mixed use property, for example, they're two different uses. And so you have to think through, how can we ensure that there's, what conditions can we put in place so that that change in use is not so abrupt? And that there's some harmony
Mhm.
in that process. But as I say, it's two different uses. And so you can't completely reconcile that and make it, perfectly smooth. But we tried to think through that.
You thought through that. We actually haven't shown it anywhere. Am I correct?
Say that again.
We actually haven't shown anybody that anywhere, how it relates.
How do you mean by relates?
The maximum height in the new MF zone is X and the neighboring property is Y.
Well, there's also this, we're also being compelled by HCD to upzone. And so we're talking about different densities.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean about you can't completely
I
reconcile
agree.
it.
I
So you
understand.
try to put into place controls to sort of ease that transition. If that
Okay.
makes sense.
One of the discussion, actually, this is I guess it's both a legal question and an ASCC question. One of the things you in the ASC noted was the concern about off-street parking. Aside from the one area, I thought, I'm verifying, I thought I had seen in the total code that generally our parking regulations applied to all of the new zonings, with the only exception being state mandated exceptions. Is that how we ended up, or did I misread that?
Well, we had to expand our off-street parking to apply to these new uses
Mhm.
because we didn't have any standards that applied to multifamily. And so we added that in. Same with mixed use. We just don't have existing standards that address that use, the kind of parking that would be necessary to support that kind of use. So that is new.
Okay. Question for the ASCC. So you had a number of concerns. On the other hand, we got 30, 40 pages of draft. In general, did the rest of it kind of look okay? Is that, you'd sort of have a base, you'd be, when you're on your Monday meeting, would you be sort of saying, okay, we need to modify line X, that type of thing?
I think in general, we felt a lot of the rest was okay. Granted, we had so little time. So I wouldn't say that we spent really any time on the mixed use or the affiliated housing much. So I didn't see anything objectionable in there. Affiliated housing referred to the code, the other zones. So that kind of take credit for itself. The mixed use was tricky. We just didn't have time to spend on that very much. So it was only in the context of whether the design guidelines again referred back to the design, the general design guidelines for for all the zones. So that was the only context.
Okay.
We didn't talk about the mixed use per se in
Gotcha.
terms of commercial and
Yeah,
terms of that. So-
Right. You had limited time. Okay. I'm going to go to public comment with the idea that I'm trying to fit in Carter first, since he seems to have a deadline here.
Through the chair, I
Oh.
don't have the timers embedded in Zoom.
Okay.
Do you want me to manage time or?
Yes,
we can-
please.
Yep, okay.
All right. If we could,
So let's start with Carter.
yeah.
Thank you very much. John, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Please go for it, Carter.
Great. I've got a short set of, comments, related to our recommendations. The most critical of the recommendations was to add the floor area ratio and the landscape area ratio. Those were the two elements, that were from the subcommittee's, standpoint, would do the most to protect the town and to give the opportunity for a developer, to develop, buildings that would be rural in character. I know that there would be, an idea that those would be limiting. And the concept that I used in looking at that, because I did some, mathematical modeling, that I will share with the ASCC, at our next meeting, was around around the 800 to 1,600, square feet, per unit. If you wanted to go to a totally objective standard, before design review, an 800 square foot, average unit size or floor area per unit size, so that
everything below 800, square foot, as an average, would essentially have, a very, very straightforward path, to approval, and everything over 800 square feet, per unit, that would give, a very, very specific threshold. And it would allow for enormous flexibility, on the properties zoned, MF 23, to establish, some, 15% small units, all the way up, to large units, because you'd end up with, 42% of the lot area available in floor area. And the reason that, that putting in a coverage area, and a floor area limit that were actually different, was to encourage the kind of massing that we're hoping for. If the coverage area is larger than the floor area, then you're encouraging buildings to be 1 story. If the coverage area, is 50% of the floor area, then you're encouraging 2-story buildings, and so forth. And so, as I looked at the modeling, what I was trying to do is develop interesting buildings, that would be, kind of 2 to 2.25, stories in height. So there would be, some availability, and also to recognize how much, impervious surface or land area is required, for the parking. I recommend, that while the ASCC subcommittee recognized that parking is probably under recognized, as a driving need on the site, that I wouldn't change it right now, because I think it does cause, longer range problems. The last thing that, is actually important, is the reduction in building heights, because I think, the 42 feet, without looking intensely at testing, of those potential massing diagrams, 42 feet is really, really tall when you compare it, to the 34 feet, that the town currently, enforces. And so, it was our recommendation to allow 4 more feet, and, 6 more feet, in vertical height, which would, allow the kinds of massing, that my mathematical massing, would look at. I do believe, that in order to help these, projects become affordable, that some average floor area limit, for, the multifamily will provide more opportunity for, the developers to develop, units within an affordable class. The issue of using the zoning ordinance as it was proposed by the consultants, with only the coverage area, the setbacks, and the height limits, I think, also like Gina, we're concerned about these buildings becoming really big and really fat, because they would have the ability to produce very luxurious, quite large units, more similar, to, housing, multifamily housing in Palo Alto and in pretty ritzy areas. And I don't think that needs to be the intention for this round, of housing. So I think the floor area limits, the ASCC could pretty quickly get our arms around these 3 critical areas of floor area, landscape area, and reduced, and building heights, which I think would go, to the greatest degree possible, to make the zoning ordinance support the rural, environment of Portola Valley.
Terrific. Okay, thank you, Carter.
Thanks for letting me fit this in.
No problem. Take care. Okay, we have the rest of public comment here. since I just did one online, do we have anybody here? Oh, wait a minute. I actually had Tim Clark. Tim, since you turned in, we'll give you a chance.
Yes, my name's Tim Clark, and been a member of Ladera Community Church for almost 40 years. And I've been advocating to our congregation do some affordable housing on a half acre that is adjacent to the church, but it is a separate parcel from what the church is on. Our parcel for housing does lie in Portola Valley. The church itself is in San Mateo County, so that's a different jurisdiction altogether. That parcel has been largely unused for 50 years. There was a community garden that was on it at one point. And there are 3 beautiful heritage oaks on the property, which our congregation has expressed an interest in retaining. So we're taking a half acre parcel and taking out about 1/3 of it to save the trees. That obviously reduces us from what is in the zoning code from 23 units per acre down to significantly less. I guess my one comment about the zoning code itself is I don't see where 6 units per our parcel fits in your zoning code. It's too big for MF4. And I think this was a point that Commissioner Flynn was making earlier. And it's too small for MF23. I don't think we'll be the only place in town where that's an issue. And I think that might be something you want to address. Secondly, we did talk about 10 units at the beginning, and it got whittled down. And that was what, but it still got written into the housing. We understand that that creates a problem for the town of Portola Valley meeting its requirement number of units. We can only do what we can do and sell our congregation. So it's going to be 6, I think, maybe a little bit less. We're using Habitat for Humanity as our partner, but we're trying to use them. We're looking for we're trying to get a congregational resolution to negotiate with them starting before the summer so that we can work out details. That takes a congregational vote. And when we put up a resolution in the fall, we had 14 amendments for people who had a little bit different idea. So we're working that out internally as well. And that's one of the ways we got from 10 to 6 and save the trees. I'll tell you, I really appreciated the comments that Commissioner Flynn was making about simplification because as I read these documents, we have small project. We want to be able to, for cost and other reasons, to be able to use modular units. I have to use the right word because some of the other words for that are a little bit loaded. It could be built off site. Habitat has begun to do that for small projects like ours, to use these modular units built off site. And that's what they've said they'd probably do with ours. So however you handle modular is going to be very important to us. I can't judge from what's in the document here, whether it's appropriate or not. I also have raised a question in the letter that I sent to both bodies that are represented here, a question about wood and allowed materials. Wood was not mentioned as an allowed material, and that's the way most modular housings are built. That's the advantage of modular housing is you can build them with wood offsite and you can build them in scale if you wish to. So that remains to me a question: is wood going to be allowed or not? And I think I left my last question on a piece of paper that's where I was sitting. If you don't mind, I'll walk.
You're running a little long, but go for it.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I'm not a regular at these meetings, so I don't even know what the time limit is. I'm sure it's 3 minutes or so. I know I've gone beyond that, so I appreciate that. I also guess the last point I'd say is that we applied to be an affiliated housing site about 4 years ago and were accepted by the town council. It's not clear to me what we were sold on that at the beginning by saying affiliated housing is going to be one route you could go to build your housing. You could then go by the zoning code when we get a zoning code. So far, I don't see what the distinction is. And I haven't heard it articulated here. So I'm not sure we have those two paths. I'd be happy to talk to anybody in more detail about what our plans are, but I know it's building out.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back online and go to Dave Cardinal. You're on, Dave?
Yep, I'm on now. Thanks. Thanks, John. Yeah, well, first of all, I want to echo a lot of what Tim said and what Carter said. And most importantly, thanks for all this yeoman task, because I think it's a year's worth of work compressed into 2 weeks. And why we didn't figure out we needed to do this 6 months ago is a different issue. Big picture, I think the question is, do we want affordable housing or not? And I do. And so I'm going to assume we do. If we don't, then everything else is just a matter of legal delaying tactics. But assuming we do, I think after 3 years, the housing element is the best we've been able to come up with as a community, and we need to try and make it work. To that end, one thing I think I'm wondering about is this, and I mentioned this to Carter, the 20 units zoning there is fictional. I think it's one lot, which is Tim Clark's lot or LCC's lot, and they're not going to do it. They can't afford to and don't want to, and they don't want to build a high rise. They're going to build maybe 6, 5, 7 little homes. So all this stuff about 40-foot houses or 40-foot buildings, maybe, I don't know, maybe we need that zoning to make HCD happy, but I don't see any place where that will happen. So I'm not, I don't get that. I think that might be a lot of time we spent. Plus, I do think if we want LCC to build, I think we have to support them. There's issues that they have that, that I think if we want them to go ahead, we need to support them on that. Finally, to Tim's point, I don't think we've done much with the cost issue. I don't think it has to be wood. A lot of the Habitat's houses are made out of vinyl, and some vinyl products are approved in the WUI, but they're not approved by us. The foundations might be different. Right now it costs $1 million to build an ADU in Portola Valley. I've heard, I don't have the money, but that's not going to work for affordable housing. So I'd like to hear more discussion about, will anyone ever be able to build affordable housing in Portola Valley? Not, God forbid, some affordable housing developers going to suddenly decide we're a paradise worth reaping. So I think we need to do this, but we need to be cognizant that if we want anyone to build anything, we need to make it possible for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Let's see, back to the schoolhouse. I see a hand up in the back. Please come up, sir.
My name is William Russell, and I live at
Oh, this, are we an issue? Public, okay. You don't feel like you need to recuse yourself?
I'm not.
Okay.
Chelsea's not involved with the project.
We're good.
That's the answer.
Okay, sorry for that. Please go ahead. Start, your 3 minutes starts over. We're good.
Please speak to the microphone.
My concerns may already have been addressed by some comments made earlier, but let me start by saying that the agreement for the development of 4370, which is what my comments related to, took approximately 1 year of hard work by the homeowners in the Nathorst Applewood development, Carter Ware, Laura Russell, and the town attorney at the time. So an agreement was reached. That agreement was approved by the Planning Commission. It was approved by the town council. It was put in the housing element, and it was approved by the state of California. So I'm assuming, town attorney, tell me if I'm wrong, that because it is in the housing element, that the zoning ordinances must incorporate what is in the housing element. As I read the draft housing element, as I read the draft housing ordinances, specifically 18.23.050, it does exactly that. It references the housing element. It has the same provisions as the housing element, including setbacks from Nathorst, front setbacks, side setbacks, etc. When I then saw the comments from the ASCC, which came in recently, they are at odds with what is in the housing element and what is in the draft zoning ordinance 18.23.050. So my question is, if that is correct, that is, they are at odds, what controls is the housing element and the zoning ordinances which incorporate the housing element. Is that true? That's my first question. My second question is, by virtue of the process that was undertaken, is there in fact a contract between the homeowners in the Nathorst Applewood development and the owner of 4370, such that you cannot change the provisions of that contract that relate to what will be built unless the parties agree, meaning that neither the town council nor the planning commission can unilaterally change the terms and provisions of that. Last question. It's been suggested that when a jurisdiction presents to the state its proposed housing element and the state approves it, that then a contract exists between the jurisdiction and the state such that the jurisdiction that presented it to the state must comply with what it has said it is going to do and what the housing element provides that it is going to do. Those are my questions.
Thank you. We'll decide at the end of those if we can answer any of the questions that come up. Let's see. Let's go back online. I see Judith Mendelson. Judy, please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Very quickly, thank you for your wonderful discussion. I appreciate hearing all of the good, careful thinking that have gone into this. I would encourage thinking carefully about expanding parking and landscaping. The more parking and the more landscaping you require, the more you require developers to build up. Otherwise, it's not affordable. So if you don't want them to go high, then you have to have less parking and less landscaping required. And I have had affordable housing developers say that if they have to build a parking garage versus just open spaces or carports, that's prohibitively expensive. So for affordable housing, you need either carports or spaces. And if we keep that number down, that keeps costs down. And then I did see in terms of style and having the style of buildings fit into our rural character, I did manage to find a few examples online of things that said things like a minimum of 2 features, such as balconies, cantilevers, dormers, bay windows, porches, and individualized entries shall be incorporated. That was kind of a nice wording to say, we want to see some of these features, at least 2. You don't have to do all of them, pick which 2 fits with your project. And also similar things saying you can't have more than 20 feet of unbroken wall, either horizontally or vertically. So you have to have a window, you have to have a change in siding, something to add interest to walls. So there definitely are examples online of ways to objectively list design requirements without making them onerous. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. Oh, there we go. Hand up. We have another one in the room. Please come up.
Hi, I'm Ellen Bernazza, 120 Nath Horse. And since we couldn't get an answer at this point for Bill's question, I just want to reiterate that the agenda today does not indicate for MU standards what is on the housing element, what has been accepted by the housing element. It has the wrong setbacks. It does not show the single-story houses that will be on the Nath Horse side of the property. And it also does not address the parking that should be on the interior of the property. So since we didn't get an answer of whether it might be good just to answer it, just so we could.
We always wait to the end of the questions.
Huh?
Oh, we group
Yep.
all the questions together.
So it's part of that, but I just bring that up again, those three things, because we have not gotten an answer to that original question. Thank you.
Great. Oh, there we go. Please come up, Karen.
Thank you. And just to clarify, I think the concern that the Nath Horse people have is that the ASCC's recommendations had different side setbacks and perhaps building height than what was in the original document from March 20th, just so that's clear. And now I would like to talk, which is, first of all, I want to thank all of you for the amazing work that you've done in a very, very, very short amount of time. And I am very appreciative that you are taking this time to do it right. So just a big applause for that. Thanks. And I'm going to put my safety hat on now. And this is a safety hat for our existing residents, such as us, and all of our future residents. I think the building height is a huge issue and that we need to bring it down. And again, you remember in one of the housing element meetings, Zeke Lunder spoke that if we have a fire, it's most likely going to come from the east down Alpine Road and block our major evacuation route. So the fire trucks with the ladders are going to take even longer to get here. And I think it's really important that we consider these risks as we move forward. I also question the building separation, and I know the Woodside Fire Protection District and others have recommended a 20-foot building separation, and that, obviously home hardening is important, but building separation is important as well. And we've seen insurance companies deny more and more homeowners based on density. And I think I'm going to be one of those homeowners because we're with State Farm and 72,000 policies are going to go away this summer. So that's another issue, and it ties to the whole affordability and being able to build here. In terms of zoning, and this is a little bit off base, but since we're rezoning anyway, in the last planning commission meeting, you talked about the frog pond and why isn't that on there as open space? I sent in a letter today and I attached the map of the open space. And if we're rezoning, why don't we protect all that open space that we've dedicated for the future and just get it in there? So that is basically that. One question tied to something Ronnie asked, which is, I don't really understand that if somebody builds something like Glen Oaks, you talked about that they build their units, they can build, why they can't take advantage of the state law after that and subdivide. This is the same thing with the opt-in. I've asked this question is if they do that stuff first, I don't see how we can take away their state right to do that later. So it's still a question out there that I think needs to be explored. And the other question I have, this is just a naive question, is I like the idea of modular or manufactured homes. The question is Portola Valley, do we have restrictions that keep people from building those because of soils issues or foundation or whatnot? And the last question was one maybe for the consultants, which is what is the average square footage for a very low income home or a low income home or moderate? Because we're talking a lot about square footage and maybe that would be good information to know. Thank you.
Did you want to, did you want to state your name for the minutes?
Oh.
You can do that.
Name for the minutes.
Did you want to state your name?
Oh. Commission-ASCC, Groveland Street. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, and I see another one in the room. Please come up, sir.
Hi, I wanted to comment on
Bob?
Huh?
Bob Turcotte?
Oh, sorry, Ron Eastman.
Ron is right.
Applewood Lane. With regard to ladder trucks coming from Redwood City or Menlo Park, there was a study that was done 13 years ago by Underwriters Laboratory, and there's been multiple studies since that have shown that with modern building materials, a chamber fire can proceed to flash over in 4.5 to 5 minutes. 50, 60 years ago, that time scale was 25 to 30 minutes. And so I think the standard has been that, if your fire department can get your house within 11 minutes, that's good. And your insurance will be lower. 4.5 minutes is not going to be enough time for a 3-story long ladder truck to get here from Menlo Park. And so you should not count on that. In Santa Cruz County, the height limit is 28 feet, by the way, in unincorporated Santa Cruz County, another WUI community. And in regard to the parking, I just wanted to point out, my son and his girlfriend, his fiance, live in a 2-bedroom condominium in Santa Clara on a street which is 40 feet wide. They usually have 4 people living there, and they sometimes have had 5 cars, minimum 4 cars. And that is the situation in the entire neighborhood. That street is 40 feet wide. There is no parking on the street at night because everybody's parking the street because the condominium, all those places come with 1 parking space. Nahorse is and Applewood Lane are between 20 and 22 feet wide. Where are those cars going to go? Don Bullard told me that he was prepared to make our streets fire lanes, i.e. no on-street parking. That would be very life-changing for us. So you have to figure out the parking situation. And we have no public transit, as you know. But they're all going to have cars. Where are the cars going to go? Thank you.
Thank you. And there are no more hands up online. How about anybody else here in the room feel the need to comment?
I see some online.
Oh, they just popped up, didn't they? They snuck up on me. Okay. Carolyn Vertonghen, please. Carolyn?
Great, thank you.
Yes.
First of all, I thank all the residents who are on this committee to try to preserve our interests. I've been contributing to this process for many years, more than 4 years. Unfortunately, and I really appreciate all the questions, but once again tonight, we have more questions than answers. And I really blame the consultants, and I'm really sorry. I'm done with it because we have spent so much taxpayers' money. You were hired to protect the integrity of our community. It's very obvious that you had no idea that we have a general plan with guidelines. We have objective regulations, and every time they changed. Every time we were promised different answers, and we have not come to resolutions. It's very sad. So the bottom line is, yes, safety was supposed to be addressed first. before the housing, and it was not. And so we're in a conundrum, and we have more issues right now than we have solved them. I will not repeat all the concerns of my residents, but an issue that I brought up, you know, you have staff and consultants who bring in more issues by adding new language and codes for supportive housing, transitional housing, low barrier navigation centers. You know, we were supposed to have an emergency center and we don't even have it. We've been talking about it. We've been talking about evacuation routes for so many years, we don't have them. And yet the housing element came first. And we all like affordable housing, but we have many questions about this new language and the new people that you're bringing in under supporting housing, transitional housing, and low-bearing navigation centers. Please answer our questions before you proceed, and please provide us answers. It's what came clear from what I heard during the discussion is ACD has a subjective authority and does not regard or consider our objective measurements. It's sad. And so we have asked that you take a stand, and you should, because it has already depleted our finances. We're already in it for $1 million and we have not gotten anywhere. It's gotten worse. And now we have to protect our safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Christy Corley. I assume it's Christy Corley. Christy. Oh, okay. We're bringing you up, Christy.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the smooth level of discussion tonight and the presentation that was given. I'm going to just comment on some things that I was listening to that I agree with. I liked Gina Dixon's idea that a local architect be involved in the feasibility study since they live here. And I like a local architect to have input. Number two, what other similar cities or towns were looked at regarding similar zoning descriptions for what we are putting into our housing element? I know Montessorino seems similar to us. Hillsborough has half of their towns similar to us. And I really think that we need to hear what you're learning from at least 2 other cities that are similar in the zoning code. And I always like descriptions of the zones readily available for the residents, because we're starting to use terminology that not everybody knows. So if you could always have that available in your meetings. You know, I'm looking, you said we have no inclusionary percentages for multi-use or mixed use. So I think that's something we as a town should consider, that we have an inclusionary percentage. And I do know that if Buffy Wicks came out with a builder's remedy cleanup bill, and she's suggesting 10% inclusionary housing. So if that's the case, that would be at least a guideline. And then I am curious about group housing when there's one kitchen and many rooms, but it only counts as 1 unit. So in one city, when I was listening to a story, they thought they'd end up with 60 units, but due to that, they ended up with 110 units in an area that they thought was better for 60. So I think we should keep that in mind as we go forward. And I do like green islands in parking places and trees to go with our housing element. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Let's see, one more popped up, Greg online.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Hey,
Give your name. Greg?
Greg Franklin, Applewood. Excellent meeting proceedings tonight by all contributors. It was really a very good session. I have a question about objective standards. Since insurability is a major issue, not just in our community, but throughout California and the nation. I don't know whether you're aware, but there was a public hearing on home insurance, which was hosted at the Cal EPA headquarters last Thursday. Some of the speakers included the most recent past Insurance Commissioner David Jones and Rex Frazier, who's a former deputy insurance commissioner who representing insurance companies that are providing 80% of homeowner insurance in California. And I think that anybody that attended or participated that meeting would have significant reservations about a housing element similar to the one that we've provided in terms of insurability and public safety. But going to my question and listening tonight, would it be possible to include as an objective standard proof of insurability? Because that would be an interesting criteria for public safety and preservation of personal assets. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I'm not seeing anybody else in the room and no more hands online. So I'm going to come back and say, are there any particular questions that staff would feel like they could answer out of or comment based on the public comments?
Admittedly, I wasn't jotting them down, but if you'd like, if there's a few key ones you'd like to raise, we can give it a go.
All right.
I highlighted a couple.
Oh, you go to, I actually was, go for it. Let's see. Tim Clark was talking about the 6, where we fit in the zoning and could we make that work? That's not really you guys. Oh, the wood. He was asking about wood. I think that's primarily whatever the current housing code is. So I think at the moment wood would be not on the list. And on first on the fire code
Like wood frame construction would be permitted, but cladding with wood, I
would not
understand.
be
Right.
for the fire code, which
Right.
is not part of the zoning.
Right.
No, I was just going to say that a lot of modular factories will produce the home with could produce the home with the wood sheathing, and then it could be brought to the site, and then you could put the fire resistant external cladding on there, or you could actually request that they build it with fiber cement cladding in the factory itself. Most of them should be able to accommodate that request without excessive costs.
That's the other questions. Dave Cardinal was concerning whether or not the 20 to 23 was actually kind of a fictional zoning, and did we really have to do it? It may be just for HCD, given that we already had it in our housing element, but whether or not it was likely to be built was one of the concerns he had.
Well, my understanding at the time, and Tim's saying things have since changed, but my understanding at the time with discussions with Bodera Church was 10 units for the half-acre-ish site was feasible and expected potentially. So when we wrote it, it was a reasonable expectation, and sounds like things have changed for them. We would run into some trouble with no net loss law. If we're not delivering on the units we've said we're going to deliver on, we have to pick up some other units elsewhere that surprise us that we didn't plan for, or we have to rezone and find another site to make up for it, likely.
That would be as we move through and are monitored by HCD, that would, if they actually turned in a project, and then we would put that on our list and say it's going to be less, and we might have to deal with that, right? So it's not something we would deal with necessarily now, We're just assuming we'll have to deal with it in the future.
That's correct.
But we can't do a shortcut and just skip this 23 zoning because nobody's going to use it, we're thinking, and save time in the next 2 to 6 weeks. We wish we could do that, but would that send an alarm bell up too soon?
I mean, like, acting as though we don't think this site is going to be developed at the density. Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
That may not be something you can answer right now. That may require some thought, quick thought, but maybe offline.
I have a follow-up question though for that. If at the end of the zoning, we have zoned that site, the Ladera site, into this MF 20 to 23, are they then legally required to do the 10 units? Because the minimum is 20 per acre. So, I mean, if they're then legally required, then we should not be doing that for them. That site should not be put into an MF 20 to 23. It should be put into an MF 4 to 6, which we haven't developed yet.
And we would run into big trouble, I think, from HCD's perspective of eliminating that site of 20 to 23.
We'd have to identify some other sites.
At the same moment, there's no grace
Right now.
period to like,
Yeah,
But
right now.
isn't it kind of not illegal or maybe not, or disingenuous to create, I mean, it creates so many problems to put that site into the MF 20 to 23, knowing that they're not going to be developing at that level.
Well,
So, I mean, I can see us moving forward and
That was
creating an MF 23 a zone, but let's not put them in there if we know they're not. So at least we solve the HCD's issue that we now have created a multifamily
Yeah,
20 to
so-
23 site.
So I don't know if Nicholas, you had something to add. I was actually say, I think this is something we can't actually solve right here. And that it would be something we put on an action item to deal with after the meeting.
Right, and I wouldn't want to make a rash decision based on where Ladera Church is in their thinking at this point in time. Things can change.
It could change.
I feel optimistic that it could reasonably change.
Okay, let's move on. We had questions from Bill Russell that were primarily, I think, of a legal nature. I don't know if you want to do that in public or whether that would be something to handle offline.
Well, I think I can answer just the last question about what the town has committed to in its housing element. I mean, to implement the programs that I identified there, yes, that is what the town has committed to. And one of those is making these zone changes.
Okay. And things like contract and that, I don't know if you want to deal with that offline or.
Yeah, I wasn't privy to any
You
of
don't
those
know that, okay.
conversations. Don't know
Okay.
any of.
Right, cannot
what
answer that
occurred.
now.
Well,
I was just gonna add, we did, for example, stipulate certain setbacks
Mhm.
in mixed use in our housing element, and those do need to carry through
Right.
into the zoning code. They have to be consistent.
Could I jump in with?
Go ahead.
Yeah, his first question, I think, was something along the lines, is it true that if there is a conflict that the housing element controls?
Right. Correct.
Answer is
Yes,
yes,
the answer is
right?
yes to that.
Right, okay, and I guess. Well, the question was the question.
So let's not have too much discussion, but thank you. Right. Did you have another question that you think he asked, which was, is it a contract?
Yeah, the other
Go ahead.
question, is there a contract between homeowners and 4370 owner such that the parties must agree to any change?
So you guys want to
think-
practice law in public? Bothers me.
No,
a
and
little
I
bit
that's
to
what I
get
said.
into that
I
detail.
think he said he doesn't know about that, so we can't answer
Okay.
that question. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. Judy had some opinions about the trade-offs that she wanted people to consider, so that's not really a question. She had some ideas about style. Ellen was unhappy with standards and things in the HE. Karen had a number of questions. relating to, oh, she was just pointing out some of the things she thought was the concern with the Nathorst Triangle people. Reiterating concerns about safety, building height and building separation. Asking about the frog pond, so that's not really.
Could I ask one of her questions?
Yes,
She asked, what is the average square footage of low-income housing?
we're getting there.
Oh,
Go for it. That was a good question. I guess that's for the, I guess that was for the consultants. Do we know what the average square footage kind of is that they were going for this? It's back to this old, there's really no one firm answer, but kind of what are people going with here for inclusionary housing and for very low income housing?
I don't know if that's specified in your housing element. It may be. I would guess that it's not. And when we do site testing, meaning we look at it, the site and the setbacks and the regulations, the physical development standards, we use it just sort of a like rules of thumb. You know, we don't plan the space out. We'll look at, okay, well, here, for example, if an average unit size were about 1,200 square feet or 1,000 square feet or 1,300 square feet, and, you know, depending on the building configuration, you may need to assume a certain percent for circulation, for hallways. It's what we do in developing the zoning codes doesn't address that level of details, that kind of internal space planning. So you would maybe look in the housing element.
Okay, I think it was more along the lines of just, do we have any idea what we're shooting for here when we actually go to do these test things and say, well, do we think that's going to work?
Yeah, I would, a lot of times, you know, we say, okay, an average size of 1,200 square feet, but maybe a little bit less, maybe we add some for circulation depending on the building type.
Yeah, so, you know, you do a net to gross. You figure the unit is going to be a certain size. 1,200 square feet, I think we use, what's the average size we use for units, and then that's about 80% of the total building. You have 20% for circulation. And, you know, site efficiency, so you can look to see what we actually
Okay.
did use in there. But, you know, it starts from the unit size and then builds itself out.
I think the other key question Karen had related to, do we actually know any more about if we rezone and then somebody later comes in and they do SB9? I think that's come up a couple of times. I think there's no good answer, right? But
Our analysis doesn't, do you want to
I
start?
mean, my understanding is SB9 applies in single-family residential neighborhoods.
okay. Single family. So none of this changes with a multi-use zoning.
I don't think, I
Multi-
mean, my sense it would not
Okay.
apply in this context.
Can't you not have a renter for 3 years or something before doing an SB9 split?
I'm not sure
Oh.
what,
For single,
yeah,
for single,
single
he
family.
said for single
Single
resident,
family,
single family,
yeah.
yeah.
I'm just thinking that could preclude some splits.
Let's
We
see,
do have
Ron.
an SB9 ordinance where we've stipulated all the requirements that are set out for the town. If you want to take a look, we're not proposing to alter that.
Let's see, Ron was talking about, well, he was just echoing the concerns on trucks and flash shower, fire spreading and parking concerns. Carolyn was not happy with our consultants. There wasn't really a question there. Christie had interested in some of the similar cities that we might have taken a look at, which I think are primarily, the question related to what are some of the similar cities, you guys have probably answered this a couple of times already, but you know, that you've been looking at and working with that might be comparable to Portola Valley.
We've prepared, most recently, objective design standards for rezoning in Piedmont. Community with very similar concerns.
We're working on objective design standards for a few other communities also in the Bay Area and in the LA region.
What was that? I couldn't hear.
A few other communities in the Bay Area, a few on the peninsula, a few in the LA region, some more in the Central Valley.
Okay, and then I think the one sort of, Greg had a question about if proof of insurability was some kind of objective standard.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
Just also wanted to let you know, in terms of your neighbors, that we're doing objective design standards right now in Saratoga and Millbrae.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I think we've done as good a job as we can on those, and I think it's time to have another bio break, and then we'll come back for discussion. So I'll give people, we'll come back at 11. Okay. All right, let's go. Ronnie, you had a mixed use question that we
Yes.
hadn't got to, and did it relate to the Jim White project?
Yes.
Okay. Nicholas, you may have to, a
Yeah,
couple,
it
yeah.
can be fairly quick, I think.
Yeah, okay. Don't go too far.
We have a way to get a hold of you? Do I have your text? I don't think I do, if I'm the one on task. Thank you. Yes, perfect. It's 971. Right now, just.
Okay. Okay, Ronnie, we're good.
Okay, so about the mixed use design standards and specifically the non-residential dimensions in 1823-060. There's in C2, it says non-residential space, ground floor leasable commercial space shall have a minimum depth of 50 feet, or at least 50% of the length of the building, or a minimum length of 30 feet, whichever is larger. And my question is, why do we think we want that requirement of the 50 feet and or 30 feet? And also, what is the definition of ground floor leasable commercial space? And also, would this requirement preclude having something like the cafe at Willow Commons?
So the 50 by 30 foot depth, we chose that to allow for properly usable space. It's generous enough to support a variety of uses that could be permitted in that zone. But are they off? Perhaps it's a bit too generous and we want to allow for smaller spaces, with just a couple of employees running a particular shop. So we'd be happy to get feedback on that if you think that's too large of a minimum.
But so I guess part of the question is, it says this requirement is for ground floor leasable commercial space.
Right.
So is there other type of non-residential ground floor commercial space or ground floor space that's either not commercial or not leasable or something like that?
No, this maybe saying ground floor leasable is a little too specific. Because it could be that the owner lives upstairs and they own the shop downstairs too, right? Doesn't have to be quote leasable. It just needs to be commercial space. So maybe we just remove the word leasable because it suggests that the space must be leasable when it might be an owner operator.
So it's establishing this minimum size for commercial space
On the ground
that
floor.
would in fact preclude having something like a cafe.
Right, so that's the other question. Yes, it would preclude a cafe. Earlier drafts that staff and consultants had prepared did permit retail and restaurant. But after a lot of collaboration with neighbors, we decided not to allow it. The intention there was to be very conservative and to replicate the non-residential uses that are already permitted in AP. So that was just a decision based on conversations at the time. There was a lot of back and forth that informed the decision. But you know, if this group wants to reopen that discussion and say, hey, we should allow for small cafes or coffee shops or what have you, we could have that discussion.
So one thing is I guess the size, and then the other is the use of, if it has to be,
It's just in reference to ground floor commercial space, that's all. So if the space is intended to be commercial use, then we're saying it needs to be minimum 50 by 30 in size.
I thought you were saying additionally that it's specifying that the space can't be used for food service. Is that not commercial?
Yes, so there's a list of uses that we've permitted for mixed use. And what we decided to do was just go ahead and replicate more or less the uses that are currently permitted in AP, administrative professional. So that's why we made that decision. I think earlier on when we were thinking through, we thought, yes, let's include cafes, you know, restaurants. And then based on neighborhood discussions, we said, no, let's not do that because it's straying from current allowable AP uses straying too far.
Okay. And I guess I'm seeing now these are the ones in 1823-030 conditional uses permitted.
Right.
Okay. And so for those uses, we have this minimum size building.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it's not tied to a specific use, but rather if it's a commercial use, meaning non-res, we've laid out this size minimum of 50 by 30. And as I say, if that sounds too large, it's going to be prohibitive to small businesses, then we should think about that.
Okay.
So as a follow-on to that, I had a similar question on mixed use in here. And I was dealing specifically with the supportive housing overlay. And I could swear, I'm trying to find it, that somewhere we indicated that for supportive housing, we would be able to do things like cafes.
Right. So the Willow Commons site has its own supportive housing overlay. And that's stipulated in the housing element.
Okay, so they could do the cafe
Right.
is what we've written into what we're doing here.
Yes.
Even though it's not obvious. Okay,
Right. So you defer to the overlay for additional standards.
okay.
But does that only apply to Willow's Common?
Yes.
So it doesn't apply to the property to the left?
Correct. So that overlay was negotiated with the landowner.
I think the property to the left also gets the overlay. Because that's also the White's property.
Oh, yes. Pardon me.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, yeah.
that's correct.
Yeah, you were thinking property to the right.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, because from what we understand, the property owner intends to do perhaps a complementary project or a similar project in the future. On the vacant parcel.
Gotcha. Okay. That's my question on that. All right, let's get Nicholas back.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, maybe I've missed something, but I'm a little confused where we are in our agenda here.
So we are just, we are coming back to discussion.
Okay,
So I had forgotten that we had a couple of multi-use questions in there, so we kind of just stuck them in after the public comment. That was my
Good.
fault. We were
Good.
supposed to kick Nicholas out earlier.
thank you.
And as soon as he's come back, we'll start our general discussion. And I'll probably start with the ASCC first, since I started the other way. He's back. Okay, so now we have a discussion, which we try to figure out, and I'm sort of gonna come back to some of the things I wanted to accomplish, is get some clarity around what's in scope and out of scope, that we need people to work on, where we have a common agreement in terms of what we need to do, or alternatively, we have no choice, even if we had it, would like to. And then dealing with planning to move forward for next steps. So those are some of the things I wanted to deal with. Of course, other folks are welcome to bring that up as part of discussion. And since, like I said, as I started with the Planning Commission last, we'll start with discussion from the ASCC. What are your overall thoughts? And I'd specifically welcome them in those areas I was asking for, but anything you like is good. Anybody want to start?
For me, I'm waiting for Monday night. I feel like we had our meeting, we did what we did, we came up with our report, we gave our report. I'm done. I mean, we're gonna meet on Monday and do some more work. So, I mean.
Okay.
In informational hearing from you guys, we'll take it to the table and do some more work.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Have anything to add?
Rebecca, do you have anything?
I mean, I would say the same thing, that the expectation is that we come out of this with the agenda that the ICC would have another meeting on Monday to kind of hash out some of these details. I think the objective for the ASCC is to come up with a very limited amount of changes to the zoning amendments that would include either unit size or floor area ratio, the height limit, the landscape area ratio, and do a brainstorming about what a simple building requirement would be, and try to create some objective standards for our design guidelines, of which some of them we already have. That would be my main thing, that we come away with that next Monday with something that we can hand back to the Planning Commission. I guess that's my
Sounds
main
great.
thing.
Yeah.
I agree. It would be great. I think you've already sort of done it, but to hear from you in terms of, if there are certain aspects, I think Rebecca's listed them off, just confirming that our direction is correct and what we plan to focus on Monday, maybe.
Sounds good. All right, planning commissioners. Who wants to start? There we go.